EEOC.org. Type EEOC in the search bar. And from this, we transition to a security forum with former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper and former CIA Director Michael Hayden. They're joining other national security officials to talk about some of the threats to democratic institutions. It's hosted by George Mason University in Virginia. We join it live in progress.
But you two, if you two were both right now sitting on top of the U.S. intelligence community, would you be meddling in Russian affairs as a best defense is a good offense kind of maneuver? Would you be advocating for doing the things to Russia that they're trying to do to us?
So I think I would be in the mode of imposing costs, all right? Doing what it is they do to us, I don't think would in any way be reciprocity. I mean, it's just a totally different system. And so their leverage...
They have weaknesses in their society.
But they have, yes, but they have different leverage points. All right, so leverage points might be the fact that you've got the Siloviki, the strong people around Putin who are living very, very well, and most of the country is not. And reviewing how and why and to what degree they live well and others don't, I think would be a very useful tool. There was a fascinating dialogue, Jeff, March. You had the outgoing commander of Cyber Command and the incoming commander, so Mike Rogers and Paul Nakasone, separate points in front of the Armed Services Committee and then the Intelligence Committee, being asked by senators, well, you've said the president hasn't given you specific directions, but if he asked you, what can I do, what would you do? And both of their answers were, separately, outgoing, incoming, was they haven't paid high enough cost. We need to impose costs on the Russians, which is not at all defending against the Russians. I mean, they obviously would be in favor of defending, but that's not what they were proposing here. They were proposing costs.
More action.
More action. And as Cybercom commander, they were in essence asking for political and legal guidance above the normal threshold of cyber espionage, but below the threshold of what anyone would define as armed conflict. In other words, a very aggressive, cost-imposing strategy against the Russians, not preventing them from doing what they do, but making them come to their own conclusion that it was probably a bad idea.
Right. Jim?
Well, the other aspect of this you have to consider, which we ran into in the Obama administration, particularly with respect to reacting to the Russian meddling contemporaneously, was you always have to weigh what will be the counter retaliation. And that's what tempers, I think, from a political or policy standpoint, the use of cyber offensive weapons. Because unless you are pretty confident in your ability to withstand a counter retaliation, and that you're resilient enough to recover from it, you want to think twice before you take any kind of actions like that. So to answer your question, Jeff, if it were me sitting there, I would say, I certainly think that it would be appropriate to tee up a menu of things, options that the policymakers can, to include policymaker number one, could decide on, but also be sure to point out what the downsides are of employing any of those tools. You may recall that the reason, what occasioned or heightened the strong personal animus that Vladimir Putin had for Hillary Clinton was because of her alleged role in promoting what he thought was another color revolution during their election in 2011. So this is clearly a vulnerability of theirs.
Right.
The decision is, do you want to exploit that, which we certainly could.
Right.
But you need to think about, okay, what are they going to do as a counter to that? And that always, Obama administration took a lot of criticism for not doing more at the time. And that is part of the calculus that we got into, because it's not as though we didn't seriously consider all this at the time.
I need to add, though, something Jim suggested earlier, and I just want to highlight. All right, what we just talked about here is pretty much the equivalent of a painkiller. All right? The fundamental issue here is not Russia. The fundamental issue here is the United States. And we would have a degree of this problem, and I think a serious degree of this problem, even without Russian.
Our own societal weaknesses, or the system?
I can't prove Jim's premise that the Russians flipped the election. So I just simply say that's not just unknown, it's unknowable. So it's not very interesting. We're not going to talk about it. Donald Trump is the legitimate president of the United States. And so now the question is, how is President Trump governing? Right? And that's the core issue here.
One more question on that. As intelligence chiefs, if you were in office right now, would you be comfortable sharing very, very sensitive intelligence information about Russia with the President of the United States?
Binary choice. Carry Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. You get the secrets.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's no choice there.
There's no choice.
You're obliged to be as forthright and fulsome with whatever sense of intelligence you have. Right. Absolutely.
Let me lift up and ask you this question about our strength as a democracy right now. Because again, we're talking about a symptom, not necessarily a cause. Years ago, Frank Fukuyama wrote, obviously, a very important article, The End of History, in which he posited, essentially, that the world had come to the conclusion that market democracy, liberal democracy, was an endpoint, a political endpoint. Everybody had agreed that this was the way we were going to organize our societies in the future. 3-4 years ago, President Obama spoke regularly about a moral arc of the universe that was long but bent toward justice. There was a kind of feeling through the previous several presidencies, that time and human behavior were on America's side, on the side of democracy, democratic development, and that we were aiming toward the widespread adoption of an American model. I'm surprised, a lot of other people are surprised, at just how fragile this idea is. And I'm wondering if that, for you two, is among the bigger surprises of the last couple of years, or how you think about the durability of American democracy and the democratic experiment. That's like an essay question, but answer it in a minute.
I mean, that's a very heavy question. I do recall President Obama speaking about this both privately and publicly about, the great institutions, the values, norms of this country, which have been durable, but they're all, at the same time, they're all so fragile. And if the practitioners and supporters of those institutions, norms, standards, and behavior choose, for whatever reason, not to support them, then we're in real trouble. And so I think these institutions are a lot more fragile than people think. I think we take them for granted because they've been, it's the way we've been for so long. I do think it's one of the reasons why, let Mike speak for himself, but I think it's one of the reasons Mike and I have chosen to speak out to make that point, to try to do our little part to try to educate the public about the fragility of our institutions.
Right. I'll come to you in a second, but noting something interesting about, this seems now a normal conversation with these two gentlemen, but imagine 10 or 15 years ago, these two gentlemen being considered political dissidents in our country. Sitting you're not exactly from, let's say, Haight-Ashbury. Something remarkable has happened where people, you ran the NSA, for goodness sake.
Jeff, let me speak to that real quick. Let me jump in here because I want to talk about Mike.
I think it's the mic.
The mic is slipped, I think. Maybe move it up.
I retired from the military. You hear that? Tension on deck, I retired from the military 23 years ago. I never gave a thought to speaking out or going on television or any of that. But, my dad was a signal intelligence officer for 28 years. So it was almost genetically antithetical for me, to speak out. Well, we're in a different mode here. And I will always be indebted to Mike Hayden because, low point of my time during DNI, both personally and institutionally, was Snowden and his aftermath. And Mike did a great public service to this nation and to the intelligence community because he could go on the tube and explain things to people that I'd spend days trying to get cleared through all the lawyers before I could say anything about it. And I remembered that model, a prototype, the example that Mike set, and he continues to set. And I said, it's my turn, I'm going to do the same thing.
That's very, very kind. So back to your original question, how fragile is this? I begin my book by reminiscing about walking through wartime Sarajevo. It's about 1994, beautiful city, formerly, and you could see along the skyline and mixed in with the Austrian government buildings, you had steeples and minarets and onion-shaped domes. So this has been a vibrant, tolerant city. And you could see in the hills above it Serbian artillery. And you could see in the streets below the results of the Serbian artillery. And what struck me at the moment, as I was walking through and talking to Sarajevans, was not that they were different from us, but how much they were not different from us. And so the thought that I had, and I've kept in my heart, that that city was the host of the Winter Olympics 10 years before that. Okay? The veneer of civilization is actually very thin, and although it may be our natural right, according to our theory of natural law, it is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, and therefore needs energy and nurturing and care, and we should not take it for granted.
But how fragile really is it? Because we've been doing this for 240 years. Granted, the 1860s were not an apex for the system, but we came out of the 1860s as one country. I mean, on the other hand, it seems remarkably durable, and it seems a little bit fantastical to think that a reality TV star can undo what took Americans 240 years to build. So, I mean, we talk about this thin layer, this veneer of democracy and civilization, but...
So to respond, I don't think he can undo it in 4.
Can you undo it in 8 is the obvious follow-up? Okay.
Yeah, I do.
You do?
I do, yeah. I mean, the sounds you hear from across the river are institutions digging in, all right, and following what our perception is the rule of law. And how long can they withstand? Because, I mean, we have made the presidency a very powerful office. Read the Federalist Papers, all right? There are reasons we want him to act with dispatch, all right? And let me give you another historical moment here. And I'll be really efficient about this. I don't think it's 1860. I think it's the 1890s. All right, now very, very quickly, in the 1890s, there was a lot of turmoil in the country, fundamentally because we were trying to adjust the institutions that had governed us as an agricultural society and to convert those institutions into ones that would serve an industrial society. Right? And we actually had a populist run for president twice, William Jennings Bryan. And he wanted to monetize silver, inflate the economy, ruin the financial class for the benefit of the debtor class, which would have prevented industrialization. Now, the kicker is he lost twice. We were going through, and we got Teddy Roosevelt and McKinley. And we got a get on with it, adjusting the institutions, still anchored in the first principles, but adjusting them, Sherman Antitrust Act and so on, in order to govern an industrial society. We are now trying to do the same thing, adjust the institutions of an industrial society to govern a post-industrial information age, interconnected, fill in the blank society, all right? And a populist ran for president again, and he won. And his response to this is, we don't want to become that new society. We don't want to be globalist, all right? We want to be, we don't want to be protectionist. We don't want to be all the things that new society is, he is pushing back against. So my fear is not just the kind of the general brittleness of these institutions. My fear, Jeff, is we're not getting on with it. And we're not making the adjustments. And so if...
Of course, China is, by the way.
Yeah. And so it's just not a static, well, they've worked for 250 years, why won't they work for the next 25? It is, no, we've got to make changes, and if we refuse to make changes, they will fail.
Right. We're going to go to questions in 1 minute, but before we do, I want to pivot from what you said toward the future. And you talked about the institutions across the river. Well, actually, it's on this side of the river that I was thinking of, to tell you the truth. No, I want to ask a very specific question.
The zip code is still a DC zip code.
DC zip codes. Well, how about let's talk about both sides of the river for a minute. And I want to ask you a narrow question that leads to a big question. The narrow question is, how do you buttress the laws and institutions so that they can withstand the changed norms of this president? Which is to say, let's talk about the Pentagon and the CIA, just as two institutions. Just throw in the Justice Department, whatever you want.
FBI.
The FBI, obviously. How do you buttress those for the next 2 or 6 years so that they maintain their coherence and cohesion and their commitment to constitutional democracy? And then the larger question is, when you think about the future, how do you defend the parts of America that you believe are worth defending, the parts of this system that are worth defending? So, I mean, take it narrow and go big, or just go right to big. Both of you can take that question.
Well, I think, I mean, it's pretty ponderous questions here. But I think
I'm a ponderous guy.
something I've observed is, whether it's conscious or not, but a lot more local activism. And you travel around the country and you see what governors are doing and mayors of cities. They're trying to get on with what's right for their communities, their states, whatever. I do think the activist groups need to try to keep, and the media need to keep the administration honest and call them out when, continue to call them out as monotonous as that becomes, when there are distortions or lies. So I think there's a lot of, and at the individual level, I get asked, and I'm sure Mike does too, well, what can I do? Well, one thing you do is next Tuesday is vote. That is an ever, a cherished feature of our system, and we, all of us as individuals, need it to protect it by exercising it.
The challenge is how do institutions push back against the most norm-busting president in our history without violating their own norms? And so, for example, in front of you now are two career intelligence officers on the edge of violating their own norms by being here. Okay? And the fact that we're both under contract to CNN, all right, as you suggested earlier, my goodness, that's really different. And we're not alone. You got Morrell, McLaughlin, Bash, Phil Mudd,
John Brennan.
John Brennan, all out there because we deeply feel about what is going on in the country. The line we used when we don't coordinate, but when we talk to one another. Right, yeah.
Maybe there should be more.
But the unifying thought, I think, that we share is that this isn't normal. We shouldn't pretend that it is normal. We should keep emphasizing it's not normal. But again, how do we do that without violating our own norms? So Jim's career military, I'm career military. Donald Trump is the commander-in-chief, period, dot. There's no question about that. And so I'll give you a real-world example now. All right? How does the NORTHCOM commander talk about the security theater that is his operational order to send 5,000 troops to the southern border? Right? Look.
NORTHCOM is commander of North America.
Right. So look at the moral and professional dilemma that officer is in, obeying what is undoubtedly a legal order, but clearly done for political rather than strategic or tactical effect. So what is it he allows himself to say? And something you won't see, what is it he allows himself to tell his people? What does he tell his troops?
Very good question. Why don't we come over here and then we'll go back there. Do you have, there's one mic or two mics? One mic.
First, from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sure everyone's heart, thank you for all you do. So what you're talking about is so fundamental to the survival of our democracy and the world. Can you hear me back there?
There you go.
So it's so fundamental. Thank you for what you're doing as former senior government and intelligence officials. And there are some other former officials, but there are very few current officials or Republicans in Congress that are willing to say the line has been crossed. And accepting your point that in order to do that, you have to violate your norms, at some point, that line gets so dangerous, and the example you just used of a valid military order, he is the commander-in-chief, he can give orders, but when will we start to see, what will it take for members of the military, members of the administration, or Republican members of Congress to start to stand up and say, it's gone too far?
So let me
Go ahead, Mark.
let me start with the institutions, then I'll quickly jump to Congress. Again, the institutions have to try to observe their norms. All right, you realize that fixing a norm-busting policy by busting your own norms adds to the damage being done to institutions and processes. So you've really got to be careful. This is probably not going to help him since we've got TV cameras rolling here, but I think Dan Coates has been really quite masterful over the last 6 to 8 months. He doesn't pick a fight, doesn't beat his chest, but he answers questions about geostrategic issues in a very straightforward, honest way, and seems to be fairly indifferent whether or not he is on the same page of the hymnal or not of the folks downtown. The Joint Chiefs and the Secretary, I think their response to the transgender ban tweet by the president was about as close to the edge as you can get. And there the issue was...
Could you describe that for once?
Sure. The president tweeted from the residence one morning when he was scheduled to get a long briefing on his options with regard to transgender troops. All right, and he tweeted, "It's over. They're done. They're not going to be in the military." And the problem for the chiefs was that they may or may not have had a different view 3, 4, 5 years ago about transgender troops, but now they were their troops. And they had a moral commitment to these people because they were on the team, and their ethic would not allow them to abandon them. So the issue is still under study, all right, in the Department of Defense. So you do have institutions in the executive branch. What is odd is that the constitutional limit on the president should be the Article I guys. It should be the Congress. Not only is Congress not limiting the president to date, right? The president is enlisting his party in Congress to beat up the agencies of the executive branch that he cannot seem to bring to heel simply by executive fiat. I have never seen anything like that in my life.
Yeah, speaking of the fragility of our institutions, I think, and I completely agree with Mike about Dan Coates, and another one I'd cite is Chris Wray's director of FBI.
Yeah.
They haven't been out there picking fights, but when the occasion called for it, they very quietly and I think effectively made the points that needed to be made. I thought it was a very courageous thing Dan Coates did after Helsinki. When that statement he came out, I'm sure he thought about, this could be it, but he stood on a principle. And that's why I think there is a really double burden, heavy burden on the leaders of these institutions, particularly, to thread that fine line, as Mike characterizes it, between standing up for what's right and not violating the norms.
I think there was back there. And then we'll come down around here.
I want to second the motion that thank you very much for being here. You guys are the best of America. And my question is, What do you do about Saudi Arabia in light of current events?
Oh, it's our time's nearly up.
This obviously isn't company policy, and Mike maybe disagree with this, but I think we should have been a much more stalwart response to that. And I mean by that cutting off diplomatic relations, P&G and the ambassador, really conveying a message here that behavior is completely unacceptable, and arms deals be damned.
Explaining what PNGing is and what it would
Well,
do.
persona non grata, which is a term that's used in the diplomatic world for telling somebody to leave.
He actually did it to him. The ambassador actually did it to himself.
Well, he left, but he's technically welcome to return.
Right.
So
But we didn't do that.
Right.
And then this, trying to rationalize behavior. I mean, the president does have what I would call very elastic evidentiary standards that he conveniently applies, and that's certainly the case here.
I wrote a piece for thehill.com. It popped up on the site 10 o'clock yesterday, about 1,300 words on this, and I try to walk through it. First point I make is this is a really tough call for the president. This is not an easy question for any president, period. But we talked earlier about what the words matter, and you set the context, and okay, he's not responsible for the synagogue killing, but actions matter, and that's why we've been complaining for 2 years. What we have done in our relationship with the kingdom is personalize it between the young minister of just about everything in the White House and the Crown Prince, a 37-year-old and a 33-year-old. We not only don't have an ambassador in Riyadh, we haven't even nominated an ambassador to Riyadh. And so rather than having the structures of government, which I think, Jim, gives us a better chance of being, I think, tougher, as you suggest, after the murder, we have this thing based on a personal relationship, which is just structurally and procedurally wrong. And if you keep doing stuff wrong over time, bad things, there are going to be consequences for that. What I point out in the article is they did it, they intended it, and he had to know. All right?
Absolutely.
And now the intel guys have got to stand in the room there, giving the president that information and refusing to budge. And frankly, in that private moment, grabbing the vice president or maybe the national security advisor and saying, you realize if the other branch asks us, we're going to tell them the same thing too. That's hard. And again, back to institutions. I had to go and tell George Bush some really unpleasant things, but I never felt it was going to threaten my work for the president.
There were some questions. We'll come right over here. Yeah.
Hello, Nicholas Dumovich, former CIA. Good to see you. Now teaching at the Catholic University of America, and I teach undergraduates about intelligence and national security. A lot of them are interested in those careers. What do I tell them? What advice do you have for these people in college who are interested in serving their country and in intelligence, and given the conditions?
That's a great thing. I know Mike has done the same thing I've done. As we've trooped around a lot of colleges and universities, and I personally found it very encouraging, very motivating that there are a lot of great young people out there that are very interested in public service, specifically in the national security arena and in intelligence. And what I try to tell them is what attracted me, why I was motivated to stay in it as long as I did, that it is a noble profession. It's a sacred public trust. There's the satisfactions you get by being part of something larger than yourself and contributing to the safety and security of the country. And I have been uniformly, no college or university that I've been to. I've been to big ones and small ones. And I've always run into a cadre of young people, great young people that still want to serve and are still interested in it. despite the current atmospherics.
What I generally say, Nick, for young folks is go do it, work hard, make this president better than he would otherwise be. And then I say, take good notes, keep them in the drawer. Seriously, you got to protect yourself. I have a different story the more senior you get. And the more senior you get, the more I'm saying, you may not want to go do this. All right? Because if you are a very senior person in the administration, you have to decide, number one, whether you have any effect. All right? And that's, this is going to be on you forever. So if you're not going to have an effect, you ought to think twice. But beyond that, at the ethical level, will you be the guardrail you think you're going to be? Or will your presence give the administration more legitimacy than it would otherwise have?
Okay, so you're in Jim Mattis's job right now,
Yeah.
and the president says, send 5,000 troops down to the border to deal with this imaginary crisis. Do you say no? Do you say I quit? Do you do it?
So no fair retired persons commenting on decisions folks on the front lines have to make. But this is just the kind of question that I think that Secretary Mattis would have to think long and hard about. I mean, let me say one other thought too. All right, I go back to the intelligence part. All right, look, if we didn't have the current turmoil and y'all still wanted to have a session, he and I would be here, and y'all be complaining about all the stuff we used to do in government. All right, whether it's surveillance, renditions, detentions, interrogations, targeted killings, the whole stuff. All right, and we admit those are edgy things and things that we legitimately need to debate and argue about, and are we right? But they only take their legitimacy. They only take their legitimacy by being attached to a higher moral purpose. And if you doubt the government embraces that higher moral purpose, this loses its legitimacy and its validity.
One more?
I will say,
Go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. I will say, though, in the end, those are really highly personal decisions. And and having gone through that myself a couple times, what you weigh is, well, if I resign, is that going to be more disruptive than if I stay? And I think though you do weigh those kind of factors, and I'm sure Jim Mattis, he thinks about that as well. And anybody in those positions would.
You got one more back there? Okay. Wherever you go, you're the expert. Over here.
Thank you all
This will be the
again
last
for coming.
question.
I'm Bill Eco. I have a question about this administration's diplomacy. Our president has kind of cozied up to autocrats and has disrupted our relationships with our traditional allies. Normally, presidents go visit Canada on their first trip abroad. He went to Saudi instead. And you hear him talk about his love fest with Kim Jong-un. What is the long-term impact of the disruption in our traditional, with our strongest allies, and what kind of damage is this doing, or is this likely to be doing, in terms of the willingness of our allies to cooperate with us, share intelligence with us, work with us on bigger global issues?
You weekended in Pyongyang, so you should take that.
Well, and by the way, I want to say, Director Clapper, I read your book this summer. It was fantastic. Thank you. And I look forward to reading yours, General Hayden.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the plug for the book. That's well, let me give you one example, Bill, that I can speak fairly authoritatively to. And I spent a lot of time in Australia. I'm some honorific title I have with the Australian National University. I spent a month there last year and again this year. I just got back. And there's great concern, I know, among Australians and Canadians particularly, and the Brits, our closest Five Eyes allies, about the path of America. What are we going to pitch out of the traditional role we played, leading, championing liberal democracy ever since World War II, where we kind of set the framework for the international order. And this is very disconcerting to our friends and allies overseas. What I told the Australians, though, this year is, look, you just can't keep wringing your hands over your discomfiture with the behavior of this administration. And I said, you need to look for if I could be so presumptuous as an American, telling them, you need to look for opportunities to fill those voids. You need to find alliances that you can form. And if you perceive a leadership void, then other people got to fill it. And you see people, like Japan, I think, kind of stepping up to that and figuring out ways using soft power that they can help fill the leadership void, notably for the TPP, which was, I thought, a terrible mistake to withdraw from that. The other thing I tell Australians, and I think this is true of a lot of countries, that we have very deep and durable pillars of our relationship: diplomacy, economic, or in the case of the Five Eyes Alliance, our history, culture, and language, our military relationships, and certainly what Mike and I can attest to, some very deep intelligence relationships with lots of countries around the world. Those are pretty deep and durable, and I believe they will, at least to this point, have withstood the assaults, if you will, caused by confusion about our leadership role. And it's a juxtaposition to embrace autocrats and at the same time diss our traditional friends and allies. It's very disconcerting to them.
That's work.
Yeah, that's a great question, a good point to end on. The American strategy for the world we've now left, the last 75 years, is actually written down. It's a document called NSC 68, authored by Paul Nitze. It's available online, and in writing the book, I actually downloaded it and reread it. One of the most used words in the document, it's a strategic document that Truman requested. One of the most used words in the document, and there are pages of paeans to this concept as being something necessary to ensure a world in which American values could survive, was the word diversity. It is throughout the document. It had also called for a robust American role in order, American values, American society, American democracy cannot survive in a world that is hostile to those values, and therefore we must do what we can to create a world in which those values are more general, or at least survivable. And there are three things within the document, less clear, but I think have been the pillars of our approach. Is back to your question about, so how tough is this? How much longevity will it have? There are three things that have governed our course of action. Number one, immigration is a natural advantage to the United States. Alliances are a strategic asset, and free trade is good for America and good for the world. And all three of those now are not assumptions. All three of those are jump balls in American society, and I think that's one reason why I get it too, so much nervousness abroad. Jim talked about Australia. I was in Stavanger, Norway in late August. I'm walking around a trade show, got recognized, a Norwegian came up, talked to me, made a couple mild complaints about where we are as a country, and then said, I grew up in a world in which a great and powerful nation wished my country well. My grandchildren do not live in that world.
Thank you to you both. This is very fascinating to me. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Our next panel starts here at 1:15. So I look forward to seeing you back in your seats in the next 12 minutes. Thank you.
So a break in the security forum with former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper and former CIA Director Michael Hayden addressing some of the threats to democratic institutions. It's hosted by George Mason University in Virginia. The break expected to last about 15 minutes. We'll return with live coverage at that time. In the meantime, a discussion on voting rights from earlier this week.
John Funn from National Review, and now with the book as co-author, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. And here in Washington, Kristen Clark, who is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. To both of you, thanks for being with us. Let me begin with the New York Times Sunday Review. Blocking the ballot box. Elections are not just about who is running, it's also about who is allowed at the polls. Kristen Clark, how do you answer that?
You know, I think it's an important question for us to be asking a week and a half out from the midterm election cycle. This midterm election season has been like none other in the sense that we have seen widespread and rampant voter suppression efforts at the local and state level in many communities across the country. And ground zero for this perhaps has been Georgia, where we have seen local officials on the ground in places like Randolph County working to shutter 7 of 9 polling sites in an area that is rural, has a large African-American population. We were able to defeat that effort. And now we're fighting Secretary of State Brian Kemp at the state level, who has resurrected a discriminatory scheme called Exact Match, where he rejects or flags as pending voter registration forms that have information that don't match perfectly information in the state's database. We know that these databases are riddled with errors, and so the likelihood that you may have a number or a space or a hyphen that doesn't square perfectly with the databases is incredibly problematic. But this is a season where we see officials really erecting unnecessary and burdensome hurdles and barriers to make it harder for Americans to have their voice heard on Election Day.
Well, John Funn, let me follow up on that point, because there's a piece this morning in the Weekly Standard saying don't blame him. The voter suppression rap on Georgia's Brian Kemp is unfair, pointing out that those provisional ballots are actually real ballots, that those people will have a chance to vote just to make sure that they are the right individual. So who's right in this?
Well, I don't think this is a case of all good versus all bad. I think we have 2 civil rights at stake here. One is, for many years, we had voter suppression and complete discriminatory behavior, and especially the American South. We passed a civil rights bill to make sure there wouldn't be poll taxes, to make sure there wouldn't be discriminatory literacy laws. We need to extend those rights into the future and make sure that everyone has the right to vote without being intimidated. At the same time, all of your viewers have another civil right, which is the right not to have your ballot canceled out by someone who shouldn't be voting, someone who is in prison, hasn't gotten their rights back, someone who's moved out of state, someone who's dead, someone who doesn't exist, someone who's a non-citizen. And 16 years ago, when there was a bipartisan coming together after 9/11 and the Florida recount, we passed the Help America Vote Act. And the Democratic co-sponsor of that bill, Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut, said, we can do both in this country. We can both protect the right to vote, and we can make sure that it's hard to cheat. And we can do both, and that's what the law did. Part of that law said the federal government, in exchange for giving the states money to buy better voting machines, had the right to go in and sue the states if those databases that Kristen mentioned were riddled with errors. In some states, 15, 20, 25% of the people on the rolls are inaccurate. Well, the Obama administration, for 8 years, specifically said, we are not going to sue, we're not going to enforce that provision. So you had databases in Georgia that were riddled with errors. The legislature passed a law, it went through judicial review, and it said if there's not a match, you have to go to the polls, cast a provisional ballot, or bring your ID and show that you are who you say you are and correct the error. Those provisional ballots are going to be counted if the voter's information is accurate. I don't think we want to make this more divisive than it has to be in this overheated election season. I think we can do both. We can protect the right to vote, and we can protect the integrity of the ballot.
In an op-ed published today, you write the following, quote, "Major problems with our voter registration system have been tolerated for years. A 2012 report by the Pew Center on the States found that more than 1.8 million dead people were registered to vote, and 2.75 million were registered in more than one state. A total of 24 million registrations were either invalid or inaccurate, making the system vulnerable to fraud." Kristen Clark, your response to John Funn's op-ed.
You know, I agree with some of his points. All Americans deserve the right to vote. We struck down literacy tests and poll taxes, but I think that he's being disingenuous by not recognizing the very real threats to voting that exist here in 2018. Some of those efforts that he talked about from the 60s, we've left behind. But no doubt today we see officials purging the registration rolls, undertaking so-called consolidation of polling sites, implementing measures like exact match. And these are schemes that when we look, they disproportionately impact minority voters and lock out the voices of eligible Americans who deserve to have their voices heard. The real threat to the integrity of the process that he talks about comes when we talk about things like Russia working actively to undermine our elections, machines that are outdated and hackable, issues playing out right now in Texas where voters are putting their vote on a machine and you have the state recognizing that there is an issue where those votes are being switched over to another candidate. So let's talk about machines and the need to update and modernize them. Let's deal with the Russia threat and not focus on these rules and barriers that really lock out Americans from our polls.
John Funn, your response.
Well, of course we should worry about updating our machines. You know, we spend 1/10 of the money we spend on ATM machines at banks on our voting machines. We should upgrade them. But, you know, Kristen mentioned Texas. Kristen, you might want to be interested in knowing that in Texas, the Attorney General has indicted 4 people in a voter fraud ring, which was basically stealing people's absentee ballots from mailboxes, filling them in, or going to elderly homes and assisting them improperly in filling out their ballots. It turns out that scheme was paid for by the former director of the Democratic Party in Fort Worth. So, of course, there are problems in Texas, but there are also problems on the voter fraud side. You know, we always are told that voter fraud doesn't exist. Well, one of the reasons that we can say that for some people is we don't actually look for it. In 2013, the New York City Department of Investigation, which is the official city agency looking into fraud and abuse, sent out a bunch of undercover agents. What they did is they went and tried to vote in the names of people who were dead, people who were felons, or people who had moved out of state. They made 61 attempts to vote. 97% of them succeeded. 97%. In other words, because they didn't ask for ID in New York, anybody could walk in, give a name, and could vote. The only 3 times they were stopped was when there were mistakes that were so obvious that no one would have not noticed them, and because the felon who was trying to vote in the name of the son of the election official he was dealing with was being impersonated by one of these undercover agents, and the mother said, "You can't vote. I know my son and you're not my son." So if we had investigations along this line, we'd find there are problems everywhere. We should look at the voting machines, we should look at the hacking, we should look at voter integrity, we should look at these rolls that have 24 million inaccurate entries, which the Obama administration didn't address, and we should look at voter fraud. We should look at all of these things and not cherry pick them.
Well, let me put one other issue on the table, John Funn. This is a piece by Jelani Cobb. It's available on the New Yorker website. The headline, "Voter Suppression Tactics in the Age of Trump," and he quotes the nonpartisan Brennan Center for Justice that 99 bills in predominantly Republican legislatures designed to diminish voter access in 31 states around the country. Is that true or not?
Well, unfortunately, since the Help America Vote Act, this has become too partisan an issue. And I wish that were not the case, because I think voter integrity is something that both parties can come together on. You know, in Rhode Island, they had a serious voter fraud problem in Providence a few years ago. The Democratic Secretary of State, Ralph Morrell, partnered with the senior Democratic minority state senator, Howard Metz, in the legislature, and the Speaker of the House, Mr. Fox, who was also African American. All 3 of them passed a voter ID bill in Rhode Island, which is overwhelmingly Democratic, and it was signed by the governor, who was not a Republican. And that law is working well today. I wish we had that kind of cooperation, not just in Rhode Island, but in other states. But this has become heavily politicized. I don't think it needs to be, and I don't think it should be. I think there are ways to compromise, and maybe we can discuss the Freedom Card and other things coming up, in which rather than spend money on all these legal lawsuits, we can actually get people IDs, clean up the voter rolls, improve the voting machines, and give everybody confidence our elections are free and fair.
We're talking about access to voting, and the New York Times Sunday Review is focusing on this very issue. 2 pieces, blocking the ballot box and also how to make a voter, remind voters about their ability to cast their ballots. From your standpoint, Kristen Clark, does this prevent people from going to the polls?
We don't want to discourage or deter people from going out and exercise that most sacred right in our democracy, the right to vote. We want to make it easier. When we look at how the United States measures up to other modern democracies around the globe, we're always near the bottom when it comes to turnout and participation. And that's for one reason. That's because we've become obsessed in some ranks in the country of promoting photo ID laws and other burdensome restrictions that make it harder for people to get on to the registration rolls. We should be talking about automatic voter registration, making Election Day a holiday, easing the rules on early voting and absentee voting, and doing everything that we can to make sure that eligible Americans are able to exercise their voice on Election Day. Instead, what we have are people who tout isolated examples here and there of vote fraud that don't measure up, because what John Fund leaves out is that denominator, that out of hundreds of millions of votes cast in elections in our country, vote fraud is not widespread. But instead what we see are laws that have measurable impact on tens of thousands of voters who want to participate in our democracy.
And we want you to participate in this conversation. 202, the area code 748-8001. That's our line for Republicans, and 202-748.
Constitution Center in Philadelphia. And I am thrilled and honored to be here for this important panel about the future of the rule of law. It is especially exciting for the National Constitution Center to collaborate with YPO and the Antonin Scalia Law School to discuss these crucial questions. The Constitution Center is a unique, nonpartisan nonprofit created by the U.S. Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the U.S. Constitution among the American people. And the best way to understand the challenges before us is to educate yourself about the Constitution, and I want you all to do that by going to the Constitution Center's online interactive Constitution, which brings together the top liberal and conservative scholars in America, nominated by the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society, to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. And that remarkable model is a reminder that the U.S. Constitution is the great charter of human freedom that unites us in these polarized times and will be the anchor for our discussion about the future of the rule of law. We have a remarkable series of panelists. You have their bios. We're going to jump right in because our goal in this important session is to identify what are the central challenges to the rule of law and to begin to talk about solutions. So David, Chris, Jim, Baker, and Ken Wainscott, I'm going to begin with each of you. And David, I'm going to begin with you because you have worked with the Independent Counsel and you are the world expert on this question. When you look at the Independent Counsel and congressional oversight and presidential interactions, what do you see as the greatest threat to the rule of law?
Well, right now there's a considerable amount of debate about the correct scope of congressional oversight, and it's obviously in flux between the Justice Department on the one hand, the certain members in the legislative branch on the other hand. One of the most interesting aspects of that stress right now is I think our system is well designed to accommodate inter-branch rivalries, where the executive branch on the one hand, legislative branch on the other are having a fight about whether and to what extent certain documents or information have to be conveyed from the executive to the legislature. What's interesting here, and what I think our system is maybe not as well designed to accommodate, is where you have not just an inter-branch rivalry, but an intra-branch rivalry, where you have essentially the Justice Department and the FBI standing up for traditional prerogatives that are dear to them and important to them to maintain the integrity of their investigations. you seem to have the White House aligned with certain elements of Congress in a different point of view, and that's an unusual split, and it puts an unusual strain on the system of separation of powers that we have.
A very interesting and important observation. Congress, designed ordinarily to check the presidency, may be working with the presidency in this case, as you're suggesting, to undermine an independent investigation. Jim Baker, you served in the FBI at the highest levels and left the FBI under much mooted circumstances. When you look at the relation between the FBI and the White House, what do you see as the greatest threat to the rule of law?
Well, thanks for having this panel, and thanks to everyone who spent time setting up. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, two things, I guess. I guess the greatest threat to the rule of law, it seems to me, is a lack of sustained support for the institutions of justice, I'll call them. A lack of support of those institutions over time by the American people. If the American people don't support and trust those institutions, then the system will not work. I mean, that's the bottom line. And if I could just back up a bit, and maybe this will help explain a little bit how I'm thinking about this. Obviously, in preparation for this panel and throughout the course of my career and working with Ken and David for many, many years, trying to think about, well, what are we talking about when we talk about the rule of law? What does that mean? And it's pretty tough to boil it down, I think. But I guess the way I would think about it in general throughout a few concepts, it's really a rule-based system where the rules are clear. They apply to everybody throughout the system, including the president and everybody else in the country. That we, by and large, agree what those rules are, and that the rules produce results that most people think are appropriate, that they're just, that they're fair, that they enable, in this country, Americans to achieve the goals and objectives that are set forth in our founding documents like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And so when I say that what we need in order to protect the rule of law, the folks in charge of ensuring that we have the rule of law need to make sure that they have the sustained support of the American people over time. They need to figure out how to do that. The rule of law, to me, is, in some ways, it's not a goal in and of itself. It's not an ends. It's a means. It's a means to achieve these other things that we want in this country, such as security, freedom, prosperity, justice. But you can't, in my opinion, you cannot achieve those things if you don't have the rule of law. But the American people need to pull together and believe that it is in their interests to support those institutions that provide civil society, like the FBI, like the Justice Department, like the other institutions of government, like the federal courts. And if you don't support them, then the American people, are going to be a place that you really don't like, because if you don't appreciate how important the rule of law is to your prosperity, justice, security, et cetera, if it breaks down substantially, then we're all going to suffer substantially.
A crucial point. Learned Hand said liberty lives in the hearts and minds of the people. When it dies there, no court can save it. And you are suggesting, in the words that are coming up on the screen, public confidence, just and fair, suggests that the legitimacy of the institutions themselves is crucial to the rule of law. And when public confidence decreases in a polarized time, that itself may be the greatest threat. Ken Waitescott, you have been, in addition to many distinctions, including a candidate to replace Jim Comey as FBI director, you've been a very distinguished prosecutor. As you look from the prosecutor's perspective, arguing before juries and trying to enforce the rule of law, what do you see as the greatest threat?
Yeah, let me echo what Jim said, and thank you all for having us. This is, I think, a very timely session. The whole day is, and I listened to Mike and Jim in the last session, and left it feeling more patriotic than I walked in, and that's a real testament to those two men. Let me just follow on something my colleague said here about sort of the respect for the institution. And I think we're realizing now, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of the Justice Department, where I spent almost my whole career in government. We sort of have to continue to nourish the respect for the Justice Department, its norms, its processes, and its pursuit of fact and truth and right. And that has to come from all parts. It has to come organically out of society. Of course, in order to get that, Justice Department and the mission of federal prosecutors, agents, and the like need to earn that respect. It also has to come from within the government. I think what we're seeing here is actually not just a lack of respect, but we're actually seeing a methodical assault on the respect that is accorded to the Justice Department. And look, every president in the past has had his, I guess not his or her, but his friction with the Justice Department because the Attorney General and the people under him or her play a different role than any other agency, any other cabinet department in the government. Yes, the Attorney General answers to the President. Yes, he or she is a cabinet officer. Yes, he or she is a political officer who is answerable politically to the President. But also, and more importantly, that person is the guardian of civil liberties and justice, essentially. And so that's the higher calling that that person has to respond to. So you can go back to every administration and see where a president has gotten upset or frustrated with an attorney general because he or she is doing something or pursuing a case that's contrary to the president's interests. What you haven't seen, however, is sort of a methodical effort on the part of the White House to then sort of dismantle the construct of respect for the Justice Department and its processes that have built up over the last 200 some years. And I think what we're seeing is, as an effort to sort of condition people into ultimately being skeptical about whatever is generated by this Justice Department or the Special Counsel's office. In order to condition people into questioning it, being skeptical of what might come out later on, there's this sort of constant drumbeat of criticism to try to, and also an allegation or sort of this ongoing allegation that the department is politicized. And that way, when findings do come out, the assumption is going to be, oh, those are just, the product of, of politics. And this isn't just from the White House, just from the president. You're hearing it from, other parts of government, from Congress as well. I've never seen that, and I never thought I'd actually live to see a cynical affirmative effort to kind of tear down the reputation the department has. But we're seeing that, and it's really important that the people who are in position right now, good people, are standing up, doing their job, answering the president, but also making sure to stand up for their institution. And I think those people are playing a very important role.
That is a crucial point. Direct assaults on the legitimacy not only of institutions, but also of facts, you're suggesting, themselves may pose a grave threat to the rule of law. We should have at least one other round on specific examples. David, you mentioned congressional and presidential attacks on the independent counsel. What has the president done in particular that you think poses the greatest threat to the rule of law, and what might he do in the future that concerns you most?
That's a pretty tall order. I think it's a lot of what Ken just described, which is he has, I think, undertaken a systematic assault on the perceived integrity of the Justice Department and the FBI, and to some extent also the rest of the intelligence community. If and to the extent that is not just an instrumental effort designed to plant a seed to grow against the possibility of adverse findings coming out, but if it in fact reflects some genuine mistrust, that in itself is actually very disturbing, that the head of the executive branch has really lost faith in the integrity of his own subordinates. It's also very disturbing, I think, from the perspective of the people who work in those agencies. They certainly feel it from a morale perspective. And one of the things I think the intelligence community, sort of building off what Ken was saying about DOJ and the Bureau, and Jim saying about the Bureau, the intelligence community, I think, desperately does not want to get drawn into these political debates. An important element, a really crucial element of their culture is to stay out of that. When they've been drawn in the past, when they've gone in voluntarily even, it's ended very badly for them. and for the trust and confidence that the American people would have in them and that they want to have. So they would like to report the facts and then cleanly hand it off to the policymakers to make judgments based on those facts or whatever information they can provide. They really don't, I think, want to get dragged into these larger political and meta-political debates that I think they are being drawn into and being used as fodder for. So I think that's one of the big risks that I see. If that continues, it will affect the trust and confidence of the American people in those important institutions. It could result in them being drawn into very, very bad activities. We have a terrible history in this country, in the period up to the mid-1970s of grotesque abuses. We don't want to see that. We don't want to see corrosion of the underpinnings that have kept that in check.
Jim, you talked about public confidence being crucial to the rule of law. David just said that the president's attacks on intelligence officers undermines that confidence. Can you tell us, again, this is supposed to be an institutional and not a partisan question, what has the president done to undermine confidence in the rule of law so far that concerns you most, and what might he do in the future?
He fired the director of the FBI because he didn't like the fact that the director of the FBI was supervising an investigation of the activities of a foreign power, a hostile foreign power, in the United States concerning an election. Like, that's the biggest thing that has happened.
And yet everyone agrees he had the legal right to do that, but you're suggesting that that undermined norms.
Well, I'm not everyone. So I'm not sure about that supposition. I don't want to go too deep into that, but I would say that, let me just speak in general. In general,
but forgive me for presuming. There are good legal arguments on both sides of most hard questions. What is the argument that the firing of Jim Comey was illegal?
So I won't speak about that exactly directly. I'll say in general, though, it seems to me, so the president has certainly substantial authority, as General Hayden, I think, was talking about in the last panel. The president has substantial authority under Article 2, and as a result of all the statutes that Congress has passed to give him even more power, as well as the fact that the president has the bully pulpit, which today includes Twitter, and can communicate directly with the American people and can lead the country in a number of different ways. The president has hard power and soft power in a way that no other figure in the country has. And so the president has a lot of authority under Article 2. The president doesn't have unlimited authority under Article 2, and the president has to execute his responsibilities under Article 2 fully and in conformance with his other responsibilities in connection with the Constitution. So what I mean by that, for example, is the president cannot take an action, in my opinion, as part of his executive authority that would be contrary, for example, to his oath of office, that would be contrary to his obligation under Article 2 to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, which means the whole body of laws, the whole mass of laws. This is what President Lincoln talked about back in the 1860s. That is the president's responsibility, to somehow make sure that all those laws are executed properly and that the country is protected and that the constitutional form of government is protected, especially from a foreign power. And so, without commenting directly on this president's actions with respect to Director Comey, I think we need to view a president's actions in context and consistent with all of the responsibilities that a president has under the Constitution, and not just pick and choose parts of the Constitution or articles or clauses and view them in isolation.
Thank you for that. Ken, when the president was seeking a replacement for Director Comey, you were among the most popular candidates from FBI officers themselves, which was a great tribute. What are your thoughts on Jim's suggestions that the firing of Jim Comey may have posed a threat to the rule of law, whether or not it was technically illegal, and what are the president's responsibilities under the Take Care Clause that may be challenged at the moment?
So I'm going to do a classic DC move, and I'm going to actually answer the question you asked me before.
All right, you can do that. No, and then I'll come back to that one. Well, the one before was, what's the worst thing you could do in the future? So.
No, the one before you asked me, which I think is actually very important, is what is the impact of sort of the current environment on, people on the ground in law enforcement, the prosecutors and agents who are doing the job. And David and I were federal prosecutors, and I think about what it's like now to stand up in front of a jury, let's say, as a prosecutor. When I did it, 150 years ago, whatever it was, you stood up, you had this sense abroad, in the news, there were facts, and there were unalterable facts. And the job of the jury and the job of the prosecutor was to lead the jury to those facts. And that's still the job, obviously, and then it's the opposite job of the defense attorney to get up there and argue the facts as he or she sees them. I just wonder, and this isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but I just wonder whether sort of the drip effect of constant talk of fake news, of assertions by people, and this is across the board, and we're at this moment now. I think we realize now that we've been coming toward this moment for a long time. This didn't just happen with one election or one political turn. This has happened over time. But we now have people stating facts in a very, bald-faced way that they know are wrong. And these are people at highest levels of our government, throughout government, and it's being discussed publicly that this is an absolute lie. Maybe I just have a rose-colored view of my childhood, but I don't remember that being the case. And I just wonder whether that's going to have an impact on the American people who then make up the juries who are listening to government officials say these are facts. And that's sort of the jury trial is the most obvious example of it, but you can imagine, that's what you do as a prosecutor. You're asserting a version of facts, and you just wonder whether that's going to breed skepticism over time. And that's one of the issues I'm very concerned about, and that's a very sort of practical, process-based threat to the rule of law. That if we stop, people no longer have confidence, not just confidence in prosecutors, because jurors should always be skeptical of what a prosecutor says because we have a job to do, but sort of skeptical about the enunciation of fact and the finding of fact. I just wonder whether that's really going to undermine what is really the most wonderful legal system in the world.
David, we are seeing that polarization of facts in everything from juries to the recent Supreme Court hearings where people view the same facts and through a different lens. I'm going to return to the future question. What is the thing that the president might do in the future that you think would pose the greatest threat to the rule of law, threaten a constitutional crisis, although the definition of that term is important? And given the polarization of facts, how might America react?
Okay, so I will answer that at least provisionally, and then I want to bounce back off of what Ken just said. So I can imagine a couple of things that would provoke a real crisis, maybe in the near term, if the president did not like and claimed not to believe in the integrity of the outcome of an election or the apparent outcome of an election, whether it be the midterms or whether it be the next presidential election, that is where I think you could get into some really, really deep water really fast. And if he questioned the legitimacy of the apparent outcome and claimed that possession of the White House was 9/10 of the law, and he was not going to relinquish possession at the extreme, and I'm not suggesting that he would do that, but if you are looking for frightening hypotheticals, you can take that one to bed with you tonight. Now,
I will. Thank you so much.
Just spreading joy and good cheer.
So it is Halloween.
I think that two things that Ken's comment provoked in me. One was this horrified feeling of like, yeah, we are guys now who talk about the old days when we were prosecutors, and somehow, I don't know what happened, but we're old now. And the other thing is just sort of listening to the wisdom of Jim and Ken. I'm struck at the relationship between rule of law and culture, and how, for good or ill, and I think it is a source of both hope and maybe concern, you see how contingent culturally rule of law is. My constitutional law professor in law school said, If 3 generations of Americans in a row hate the U.S. Constitution or any part of the U.S. Constitution, it will not keep them in check. We will have some change, whether that's through the official amendment process, whether it's through some kind of court packing plan, or whether it's some other method. And what I think we have seen here is an illustration of the continuum on which rule of law at the constitutional level, at the statutory level, at the regulatory level, and even down at the sort of sub-law norm level are all connected up. And it's, I'm sure, very disturbing. It can be very disturbing for those who really think of the rule of law as an ultimate safe harbor, immune in some absolute way, like the laws of physics, from the turbulent forces of our politics over time. And that could be very disturbing, that maybe it is turtles all the way down. On the other hand, it's a source of hope because we are constantly, whether we want to be or not, in a process of renewing and changing our culture, including our respect for rule of law. And so we can stop the assault on the rule of law. And we can, as a country, through our ongoing back and forth and conversation and events like this one, renew our commitment and our faith there. So we as a country are in the driver's seat. It is contingent for good or ill at some level, I think. We can really bend and stretch and change. But that means renewal is also available to us, even if things are not going well at any particular moment.
I will ask each of you about what you suggest to encourage that renewal in a moment. But Jim, do you want to take a crack at the Halloween hypothetical as well? What's the thing that could happen that would most threaten the rule of law?
I'm not going to take a crack at that one. There's a lot of hypotheticals and so on. But I would just, if you don't mind, pick up on what David was talking about in terms of the culture, which I think loops back to what I was talking about earlier. As experienced managers know, the most important aspect of any organization is the culture. That's what really makes or breaks the success of an organization. And so when you start talking about the United States, one of the things that we have had, yes, of course, we've had very, very bitter differences throughout our history, but we have had a political culture that has embraced, that has valued the rule of law as something to be cherished, something that made us different from other countries, something that made us special, something that made us exceptional. The rule of law has made us exceptional. And so to the extent that there's an erosion in that through this sort of drumbeat of criticism about the institutions, about the people in the institutions, about the rules and so on, I think that's what will undermine the rule of law over the long run. Maybe I'm worried a bit that it may be faster than 3 generations in terms of how David was talking about it. It could be quicker than that. I don't know. We're in a very volatile world where information spins around extremely quickly. I would add, just while I have the floor here for a second, we are in a different era now. When people talk about going back to something in the past, I think that is wishful thinking. Something has changed. Something significant has changed. Our political culture has changed. And I think that we all need to adapt to that. We need to figure out how to operate in this new environment. The way the president operates in terms of the media and interacting with people, and the way that folks respond to that, I think is going to be a permanent fixture of our politics going forward. However you want to calculate it, some substantial percentage of the people in the United States support the president and appear to do so very strongly. And even when the president leaves office, they will not just magically disappear. They have views and they have perspectives, and I think that it's incumbent upon those of us who either agree with them about a lot of things, disagree with them about a lot of things, but to figure out and to understand how they think, how they view the rule of law, how they view political institutions, how they view the outcomes of these institutions. As General Hayden was saying about, many, many folks in this country feel the winds of globalism and other factors in their faces and undermining their ability to achieve what people describe as the American dream. And I think if those of us who are trying to defend the rule of law don't focus on that, then we're not going to be able to defend it effectively over the long run.
Okay, Ken, you can take the Halloween hypothetical if you like, but on the thought that you probably are not going to want to do that, we can turn to solutions. The three of you have identified an urgent national crisis, which is the undermining of a common understanding of facts and an undermining of the legitimacy of our democratic institutions, which is making it impossible for red and blue America to perceive the rule of law in the same way. So this group has convened to come up with solutions to this urgent question facing our democracy, and we have about 20 minutes left to solve it. So Ken, first to you, I mean, but let's start at the prosecutor level. You're arguing before a jury. You've got these jurors who see facts in different ways. How do you speak to them in a way that can help them converge around a common understanding of facts?
Well, look, I think that's a reality. I think they've got an additional cross to bear, an additional challenge than we did when we were going into court, because there is sort of a greater skepticism, and there is a wider divergence in the way people are viewing facts, and there's a sort of belief in the malleability of the enunciation of facts. So I think that's just a bigger burden. They're going to have to meet with a higher level of evidence, and they need to go in recognizing that. I think, though, that in terms of just how to deal with this, and this being the criticism and sort of the lack of love in a lot of ways that's coming from all directions, it goes back to what I think, David, you said. The people who are running the Justice Department are really the guardians of the culture and the mission of the Justice Department. And they have to keep that in mind with every decision they make. And I've been very proud of the people who are in those positions who have, and this is not a White House versus DOJ thing, not DOJ versus Congress thing. It's just DOJ trying to operate in these very rough seas. And so you have situations where statements that have been made that are contrary to the culture or the mission of the Justice Department, and the leadership has stood up. And for instance, is at one point, and it might have just been a sort of off-the-cuff comment by the president at some point, he said, well, maybe when you put these bad guys in the car, the squad car, it's okay, cops, if you knock them around a little bit. And look, I don't remember the context in which he said that. I understand that we watch TV, and the heroes on these cop shows often get a couple extra licks in, and nobody seems to have a concern about it. But it's absolutely imperative that the leaders of a law enforcement agency have strictly black and white rules about things. You cannot allow any deviation, even if it might be human nature, after like a highly charged chase or whatever, get a bad guy. Maybe it's sort of human nature that you would take a look or two, but you cannot sanction that as the leader of a law enforcement agency. And you recall Chuck Rosenberg, who was the head of the DEA at the time, and he issued something to all personnel, DEA, saying, said that, and I can't, once again, whether it was just a joke or what, I don't remember, but just to be absolutely clear, he said that is not something that we can countenance. That was Chuck realizing that something that might have been some sort of off-the-cuff comment that wasn't intended as a recalibration of the rules of engagement for law enforcement officials could have that impact because it came out of the president, because it came from the president. And so he was thinking long-term. And he was thinking about how to maintain the culture of his agency, and he did a real service to the DEA at that time. And that's the kind of thing we've seen over and over, where I think the leaders of our Justice Department have sort of, and I think the intelligence community as well, have sort of been watching for this incoming and making sure not only just to protect themselves and protect the department, but also protect the culture, which is so critical to its effectiveness and, frankly, its alignment with the law and our constitutional values.
That is a great example. And David, in that spirit, can you identify profiles in courage or examples of individuals standing up for the rule of law that strike you as instructive? And if you want to put any other solutions on the table, that would be great.
I mean, I was going to mention the example with Chuck as well, because I found it to be very compelling. I have seen Chris Wray in congressional testimony be very strong and very clear that he is going to follow the facts where they lead, and he's not going to be pushed around or influenced by the kinds of partisan political concerns. And I have been impressed by the strength of those statements. So I think that's another example, and it doesn't have to be quite as discreet as Chuck's thing, which I thought was terrific too, but I've been impressed by Chris when he has stood firm for what the FBI does. I think broadly speaking, it's a question of renewing our national faith in the rule of law and our respect for it, which means a lot of different things. It can mean doing certain things. It can be refraining from different things. And finding common ground where we can. Some of that's going to be very difficult. For example, I don't think either political party right now, at least any party while they're in power with the ability to do it, is going to voluntarily implement the 60-vote rule in the Senate, which is obviously a way of bringing people towards the center. One can imagine some kind of a bargain in which we all agree that 12 years from now, regardless of who's in power, we're going to have the 60-vote rule then. So that's an example of something that's a little harder to implement, but one can imagine it having a centering effect. I think one of the things that we may find over time is that people maybe get fed up with some of the extreme behaviors, whether those be outright lying or questioning facts. There are behaviors undertaken now with alarming regularity, which not very long ago, certainly in our, I've already commented on how old we are, in our lifetimes, would have been absolutely and immediately disqualifying, I think. And it just, it would have been like the person's having a breakdown. I mean, they're obviously unfit. And it's not limited just to the president, frankly. Some of our national renewal of faith may be an intolerance for certain kinds of extremist behaviors. So part of the rule of law is tolerance and toleration of differences. Some of it is intolerance for certain kinds of aberrant or heretofore aberrant behaviors that are just going to be out of bounds. And I think that's an important thing to recapture as well. Where do we want to be on what's in and what's out of bounds for people in national political life?
That is very helpful. You both identified a profile in courage, Chris Wray, and also a structural change, resurrecting the 60-vote rule, which reminds us that this is not a partisan question of the president's behavior alone, but changes in our institutions themselves, like the Senate, which has become so polarized that both parties are pushing things through on party line votes that didn't used to occur. In 1960, there was a 50% overlap between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat in Congress. Today, there is no overlap, and the signature achievements of both President Obama and President Trump were pushed through on party line votes with no votes from the other side, the Affordable Care Act and the tax law, unlike what is presumed before. So you've identified structural changes that could take place. This is a great brainstorming. Jim, structural or profiles in courage or other solutions, we must hear your views on how to resurrect a culture of the rule of law.
To quote somebody from a movie, how do I know? I can't even explain how the toaster works. But a couple things come to mind, and I'm sort of back with Ken with his prosecutor, and if I could add FBI agents in the courtroom. And so I think a couple different things real quick. The main thing is integrity. That people in the system have to maintain their personal integrity and their professional integrity at all times. And that includes always telling the truth. Always telling the truth, even if it hurts. Even if it hurts in the short term, because in the long term you'll be better off for it. So telling the truth to juries, acknowledging facts that don't fit, but dealing with them in some effective way, always telling the truth to a court, those types of things. Telling the truth when you are part of the justice system is essential. And if you don't do that, then you're not going to have the integrity that is required to serve in those kinds of positions. You really should be there. But I have confidence that people who are attracted to this line of work have such integrity, and they just need to make sure that they operationalize that, I guess, if you will, every single day. The other thing then, I think, is for folks in higher levels of the institutions to think deeply about what their values are, and to have those very clear in their minds, and in order to be able to confront the situations that they will confront. Because many of the situations that they have to confront today, there is no book to look up and answer to a particular type of question. We are in a new place. The norms that we are used to are and have been broken. And so people, I think, myself, often found myself in situations where there was no precedent. There was no clear precedent. There was no book to go to. There was no case that I could look up how to deal with this particular situation. And so myself and others were doing their best to try to figure out how best to stick to our values, which I would submit are core American values, how to implement those values in this situation that is novel. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that you face. And related to that, I think, I think it loops back to integrity, which is speaking truth to power. And when you have an opinion that's different from what somebody else's is, who might have a position higher than you, you need to speak your mind. In my opinion, that's what the American people are paying you for. It's not just to go along and be a yes person. It's to speak up, have integrity, and you'll have to deal with the consequences. But those consequences, the short-term nature of those, pale in comparison to the long-term benefits for yourself, for your family, for the country.
A crucial point. The word integrity is on the screen, and you are reminding us that it's central to the success of the constitutional system. The great Chief Justice and former President William Howard Taft introduced the noble tradition in the Solicitor General's office of confessing error when the government thinks it should not have won its case because of a constitutional violation. And you're suggesting that that kind of self-restraint, both on the part of officials and also of citizens themselves, is necessary for the success of the rule of law. This is really important brainstorming, Ken. So just another beat on a solution that you have, and I'll just throw into the mix. Is the structural challenge of social media a big part of this? The fact that citizens are making decisions at warp speed, that officials are communicating with their most ideologically mobilized base, is challenging the Madisonian notion of reason rather than passion prevailing. And if that's part of the challenge to the rule of law, what on earth can we do about that?
Yeah, to go to your second question, I'm not sure there is much we can do about that. You got this pesky little thing called the First Amendment. But then in terms of like diagnosing the problem, yeah, social media is exacerbating the problem, but it's not a problem that started with social media. I mean, you can go back and look at the 24-hour news cycle, the fact that you now have news outlets that are sort of perfectly happen to be identified as sort of being on one side as opposed to the other, not the Walter Cronkite kind of approach. And the fact that, you know, I go to certain parts of this country and they get all their news from one channel, or another part gets it from another channel. And it's all, you know, filtered through a particular filter. You know, these are all phenomena that have developed over the last decade or two, which I think are leading to greater polarization, a greater manipulation of facts and truth, and I think, you know, have led to countless things that I would call social ills, which, you know, include a deeper divide politically in our country, deeper divide about the values of our country, and a generation of strong feelings to the point of hate that are, you know, leading to some of the horrible tragedies we saw just in the last week or two.
That is a crucial point. Polarization is the underlying cause of this collapse of agreement about facts and the rule of law, and that's caused not only by social media, but by older technologies like cable news, and by other broader causes like the Big Sort, which is leading red and blue America to live in different geographic areas and to consume different social media. And that is a problem that is not easily solved. I think that we have just a moment for questions from the audience, so let us introduce those. Yes, sir. 15 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Herman Bauma, and I must say I'm a little surprised or shocked at the lack of balance so far at this conference. I was expecting a little more from George Mason University. But, I mean, there's been a lot of hand-wringing by the panelists about rule of law under President Trump. I'm wondering if the panelists had as much hand-wringing when Obama was president. You had, like, federal law against use and possession of marijuana, but the president decided just to ignore states that were passing laws to legalize marijuana. You had his executive order involving DACA. And then you had the Defense of Marriage Act, which Obama on his own decided we're not going to defend it. Did you all have the same concerns about the rule of law when Mr. Obama was president?
That is a crucial question, and it is urgently important on this panel that we identify which of the changes we're talking about are unique to this administration and which are not. And you are undoubtedly correct, sir, that President Obama used more executive orders at this point in his term than President Trump has. So, David, it's a tough question, but let's have you answer it. Is this just bashing against the current administration, or is the current administration doing something different in kind as well as degree than the previous one?
Well, full disclosure to begin, I was in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, so I probably ought to be, taken with a great deal of skepticism in anything that I say here. I think that every administration faces rule of law challenges. As either Jim or Ken said, every Justice Department gets into tension with the White House. I think it was more pronounced in the Clinton administration, another Democratic administration there, and Attorney General Reno dealt with that as she did. So it's certainly not a set of problems or challenges that are unique to this administration. On the other hand, I am wary of suggesting that there is an equivalency there. I do perceive the Trump administration and the president in particular as, in a different class of challenge to a different degree, and I think it is different in kind. The difference between extreme difference in degree and difference in kind can itself be fuzzy, but it's no doubt in my mind that it's different than what we saw in the Obama administration, in which I served in a political position, in the George W. Bush administration, in which I served in a political position, in the Clinton administration, and in the George H. Bush administration, who was the president when I started at DOJ. So I don't say for a moment that these problems are unique to the Trump administration. I do think societal factors, social media and others factors are in play here, and polarization of the country is not just a symptom but a cause. But I also don't want to suggest that I believe personally that this is just more of the same out of this president as we've seen from the prior 3 or 4.
The question is so important, all of you should answer it. We've identified structural changes that preceded this administration, from social media to polarization, as well as particular actions as well as the use of executive orders. Ken, do you think that the threats to the rule of law that we're seeing are unique to this administration or not, and is it a difference in degree or kind or not?
Yeah, sir, I think that's a fair point, and a fair question to ask. And look, when I heard about this conference, like other conferences like it, that was a question I had. Is this going to be just an administration bashing conference, or is it going to be an attempt to sort of isolate what is different about now and think about the implications and then think about the solutions? I'd like to think that our panel has done the latter, and that, and I do agree that with David that we're in a different age right now. But it's all too, I think it's naive for anybody to say this is all the fault of the administration, because this administration is both a cause and a symptom of where we are right now. And I think one of the things we're realizing as we sort of look back at where we are, realizing that a lot of these developments, a lot of these sort of new social phenomenon started a long time ago. And that's just where we are now. And of course, this administration came along with its approach to things. But, we have to look at it, and to the extent that people don't like where we are now, it's not so easy as just, voting. Voting's very important, but we have to look at some of the underlying problems that have gotten us to where we are right now. And also, and I think it's been clear in the discussion, this isn't just one branch of government. This is, the Hill has been a real problem. Talking about the Department of Justice and the assault on the Department of Justice, the most direct assaults in many ways have come from the Hill, really irresponsible ones. Now, that's something that's not new. We've had, political assaults on the Justice Department, and I'm saying assaults, not criticism, right? Criticism is appropriate, but efforts to sort of tear down the Justice Department in the past. I think you're seeing it sort of at a new level, especially when it comes to some of the Russia-related issues. So this should not be personalized to one government official, one president. We need to, obviously, he, once again, is part of this. but a cause and a symptom. We need to sort of look at it across the board. And I think, we're in a bad place right now. And unless we sort of step back and really think about deep solutions to this, recalibrating our approach, it's only going to get worse.
Jim, same question. It's urgently important that our analysis be nonpartisan and structural rather than, personal to one administration. Is what we're seeing a cause or a symptom? Is this president unique or not?
The president is obviously different from other presidents. Even he himself says so. That's what he says. I mean, I think, it's faded off the screen there, but the word that I mentioned was integrity. So I've worked under, I was sitting here trying to count, I think I've worked in the government under 5 different presidents, and I think maybe 7 or 8 attorneys general. I'd have to go back and figure that out. And I think that integrity has been critical throughout for everyone in the system, from the president on down, who is connected to the rule of law system. So I think that's the main thing that we need to be focused on. And that's not something that you just achieve and then you're done and you can just kind of move on. You have to maintain integrity every single day in every single thing that you do and throughout the institution. So that's critically important. I think as a result of that culture of integrity that is profound at the Department of Justice, at the FBI, we have strong institutions. We have strong institutions that have great cultures and that are enduring. They require, as I said earlier, they require the support of the American people over time to be successful. Everybody, including yourself. And so I do think and there have been issues under different administrations that I've been involved in where I was concerned significantly about making sure that we were adhering to the rule of law, adhering to the rules promulgated by law. And so I think it's something that we have to make sure that we maintain consistently over time. But I think we have to recognize that this president is different, has said things that are different about the institutions of justice that no other president has said. And we have to think about what that means. We have to think about what that means in terms of the impact on those institutions in the short term, in the long term, and to make sure that we end up with a country that we want and want to live in.
Thank you again for that question. And I'll just say on behalf of the Constitution Center that whenever I host a conversation like this, I ask citizens to separate their political from their constitutional views. In other words, don't ask what you think the government should do as a partisan matter, but what the government may do under the Constitution. And recognize that there are often good arguments on both sides of constitutional questions. So if you view things in those constitutional terms, one strong theme I've heard emerge from this really illuminating panel is that lack of faith in the institutions of government by citizens of both parties may undermine the constitutional structure itself. And that is not a partisan point. It's a reality of our society that has many complicated causes. And we're beginning to try to identify what to do about it, and we'll continue to do that. Bob.
Thank you. So my question is to you, Jeffrey. You wrote an article in Atlantic about what James Madison would do. And you talked about the mob and how he defined a mob, passion versus reason. I'd like you to elaborate on that. And let's segue that into solutions. We've talked about the 60-vote solution. Maybe if you could start with the Madisonian definition and move that towards some solutions that would get us back to this central place where we can all talk to each other and not be as polarized, which I think is the objective. Because the objective in this conference isn't right or left. The objective of this conference is a better democracy. Help us get there.
Thank you for that. Just as quickly and intensely as possible, because we're going to talk more about this in the solutions problem. That piece argued that Madison and the other framers meant to set up not a direct democracy, but a representative republic. They had read about Athens and Rome. They were afraid of the mob. They believed that in all large assemblies, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. So that is why they were afraid of faction. And they defined faction as a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And we've been talking about the many ways in which passionate factions or mobs have gained ascendancy, ranging from the imperial presidency, which communicates through executive order and communicates directly with the people, something that President Obama as well as President Trump did, and would have been a Madisonian nightmare because he feared direct communion between the presidency and the people, to a Congress that now doesn't deliberate, but rules by party line votes rather than regular order where bills have to move through slowly, to a polarized judiciary, to a media, and perhaps this is the most important thing, that allows immediate decisions with no time for deliberation. Madison thought that the extended republic that made people find it hard to communicate would allow passions to dissipate. But with 24/7 cable and with Twitter polls, we have Brexit votes and other instant decisions that would have appalled the framers. So we'll talk about solutions this afternoon, and I don't have a laundry list of magic bullets. But you've heard today that institutional changes would be helpful, whether it's the 60-vote rule or a return of regular order that makes it necessary for bills to be mooted through committee rather than just imposed by party leadership, to Facebook's recent decision to put higher on the news feed stuff that you actually read. So it turns on that fake news travels more quickly than real news because people will pass on a really sensational headline without reading it. So Facebook creepily knows whether or not you've read something, so they can decide not to put high on the feed stuff that you share without reading and only stuff that you actually read. That's a modest solution, but it gives you a sense of a technological solution to this Madisonian problem, which is forcing people to think before they speak and vote and dig in their heels. And those are two teasers, and I'm sure we're going to solve the problem this afternoon. But in that, if that's the Madisonian problem, really fast deliberation that allows virtual mobs to coalesce, does any of you have a solution to that problem? To slowing down deliberation, to not allowing people to declare allegiance to their tribe before they've had a chance to listen to the other side?
I mean, other than switch to decaf, not really. That
would be cruel and unusual.
I sometimes look at the problems that we've got through the lens of the Russians because you can see how they have undertaken an effort to try to exploit these divisions, and we have some windows into that. And I think it's actually instructive to see that. I think they are trying to introduce a sort of a virus into the body politic, and I think the solution, as I've tried to say here several times, is a whole of nation response, not just a whole of government even response. We have to develop antibodies to these kinds of viruses. Some of these viruses are self-generated. And I mean, I don't know exactly. If I did, I certainly would be sharing it. How to get people to be more deliberative, to be more skeptical about what they read on the internet. But I think ultimately this is still a cultural thing. We have a very rapid change in the environment. We have, I think, a non-trivial change in the presidency. We are slower to adapt to that, and our institutions are facing the strain. But I guess I am still optimistic that over time, one of the great strengths of an open society, which I think our adversaries don't fully appreciate, is how resilient it is. And I think culturally, through each individual becoming more skeptical about what they read on the internet and maybe reading before sharing, these kinds of low-level changes across a population of 300-something million people can, over time, have an effect. We can develop the antibodies. We can develop the cultural responses that will help deal with some of these threats. And so over time, you can mark me down as optimistic about America, despite the incredible challenges that we're facing today.
Great. And the Russian example is very instructive. Jim, a solution to the Madisonian?
Well, I don't know about solution, but I think people need to reorient themselves away from what is in their own personal interests to what is in the interests of the United States of America. And in that sense, they need to put America first. In that sense, that the interests of the United States come first before my personal interests. If you go talk, for example, to people in the United States military who are willing to give their lives and everything they have and everything they ever will have for this country. I mean, I'm just in awe of people who are willing to do that. And if you think of the sacrifice that they're willing to make for all of us, everybody else in this country needs to think the exact same way. And if they don't, then they're not really executing their responsibilities, and they're not claiming their true birthright as an American, because what we get to do is give to this country. That's what we get to do. We're able to sacrifice everything for something that's important as the United States of America.
That is beautifully put, and that is exactly what the framers thought that the health of the republic depended on, is people putting public good before private interest, and the whole system was designed to promote that patriotism and public spirit.
And we need leaders who are willing to emphasize those type of values.
Great, that's crucial. Ken?
Just, I guess, one point that I think we've said maybe in different ways, but we also have to have a respect for the truth in the face of political agendas. And that's teeing up what I found to be the most disillusioning aspect of the whole Justice Kavanaugh episode was, which, we could spend all day talking about different issues regarding that, but the thing that I found really distressing was how many really intelligent, high-level people got up and said, I believe X. I mean, because there are two different narratives. I believe X without looking actually at the facts. And people were driven by political agenda and then maybe sort of more gut-level preferences for one side, one version of the facts or the other. But it was, one after another, without actually, without regard to a real exploration of the facts. You had some really sober voices saying, well, let's look. On this side you have X, and on this side you have Y. But they were few and far between, and I think that was a really unfortunate aspect of our political system that played out there for all of us to see. And that, I think, talking about how to sort of get ourselves out of this mess, I think political leaders need to be held responsible for not sort of exercising their gray matter in a responsible way and actually looking for the truth as opposed to just saying what they want the truth to be for their own political reasons.
That is a central point as well, and maybe that's as good as any point on which to end, that the framers thought that we would be guided by reason rather than passion, and that meant investigating facts before making up our minds and not allowing political or personal allegiances to sway us from our duty to cultivate our faculties of reason. That's what Jefferson said so beautifully, and what Louis Brandeis said so inspiringly in the most galvanizing opinion about free speech in the 20th century, the Whitney case. Those who won our revolution, said Brandeis, believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. And that really is what I'm hearing from this remarkable panel, that unless we can step back and set aside our partisanship and allow the better angels of our nature to motivate us to be guided by reason rather than passion, then the rule of law itself will collapse. But I'm going to end with a note that Ken did, hearing a thoughtful discussion like this and recognizing that this bipartisan group of public servants is agreeing in their analysis of the structural problem and identifying solutions makes me optimistic about the future. Please join me in thanking them.
That's fun. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for another great panel. We'll get back in the room in about 15 minutes. So please join us for our next panel on international institutions and alliances. There are also snacks and drinks right outside where you got coffee this morning.
So we're taking a 15-minute break in this security forum on threats to freedom and democracy, live from George Mason University. Coming up, we'll hear about international institutions and the Trump administration. Earlier, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse spoke at the National Press Club. Here's part of his remarks.
Andrea, there's so much that I want to talk about that isn't officially on our agenda, but it feels like she gave us 15 jumping off points. One of which is she mentioned that I wrote a 520-page dissertation. There's an old joke among humanities PhD students that you write a 500-page dissertation because you didn't have time to write a 200-page dissertation. That's what I did in my under-edited project. Up here today, we've been talking about dead animal Twitter. I would like to follow that lead, if we can follow that a few times in question and answer. So if I can tee someone up to please ask about Twitter. I think Twitter is going to be relevant to some of the things we're going to talk around a little bit in my comments today. Dead animal Twitter wasn't something that I thought we'd get to go to, but I have a 7-year-old boy and we live in the country. We have 3 dogs, which is a sign of people who make bad life choices. We also may or may not have outdoor cats. We probably do, but if they're members of the Audubon Society here, I'm not going to claim that these cats are fed by me. But they deliver dead animals to our front stoop every morning. And my 7-year-old and I think that this is something the world needs to know about. So that's the main reason that I'm on Twitter. You also said that the purpose of lunches like this is to try to make news. I want to be a good guest. I'm grateful for the invitation. Betsy, thank you for having me, Andrea, the rest of you. But I want to say that why I wrote this book, frankly, is because the obsession we have with short-term news, I think, might be crowding out whatever we should define as the other thing, the other side of news. We consume lots of information, and I think wisdom literature might be the alternative to news, but not exclusively. And so my goal is not to say I want to duck making news, but I do hope that I can persuade you that some of what's broken in our time and place is claims of things like a 24-hour news cycle, which I'm going to posit over the course of our time together doesn't actually exist. There is no such thing as 24 hours of news that 320 million Americans actually need, and that means there's a tension between the ways we consume and the ways we might get to a sense or recover a sense of an American we. So I'm grateful for the invitation. We're here to talk primarily about the book. I know in question and answer we'll end up in some other places as well. But I want to tell you something about the structure of the book so that then I can dive deeper on 1/3 of it. So I structured this project, Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal, around the collapse of traditional tribes, the rise of, or the ramping of, political tribalism or anti-tribes, and then the third, which comprises nearly half of the book, is a constructive argument about what do we do? What does it look like to recover habits of rootedness in a digital age that is increasingly whispering to us, you can be rootless? I think one of the fundamental tensions of the moment in which we live is that the happiness literature is starting to tell us things that people who've had grandparents have probably known for millennia, which is that most everything that drives whether or not humans are happy are intimately connected to place. The 4 biggest drivers of whether or not you're happy, statistically, are: do you have a nuclear family? Do you have a few deep friendships, not Senate friendships, my good friend, the colleague from such and such state whose throat I'm about to tear out in our debate on the floor, not social media friends, but actual friends? Do you have friends? Number 3, and statistically the number 1 driver, the number 1 correlate with happiness, is do you have meaningful work? Do you have important vocation? Do you have a sense of calling? Do you have coworkers? That is the number 1 driver of whether or not people are happy. Not do you make a lot of money, not is there a coworker who's 3 cubicles down that talks loudly and annoys me, not does my back or do my knees hurt at the end of the day, but do I think somebody needs me? Do I think my work matters? If the answer to that question is yes, statistically you're almost certainly happy, and if the answer to that question is no, you're very, very unlikely to be happy. And 4th, do you have a theological or philosophical framework to make sense of death and suffering? Do you have a worshiping community? Family, friends, meaningful work, all 3 of those are highly tied to place, and sort of worldview questions about death and suffering, partly tied to place through worshiping community. 3.5 of the 4 drivers of happiness are about rootedness, and we're living through a digital revolution. We're living through a moment where we are constantly told we're bigger than place. We can just traipse across, we can skim across the surface of place, and we can be anywhere. But it turns out the more that you think that the world is so flat that you don't actually have to have roots in a place, the less likely you are to be happy. The more likely you are to actually expand the denominator of potential unhappiness because of news we take in from afar and the investments that we make less in the place where we actually live. So I wrote this book because of, I think, this implicit tension between rootedness, which drives happiness, and rootlessness, which is one of the byproducts, both for good and for ill, of living through a technological revolution. The digital revolution that we're living through isn't something that came about last year. We're decades into the digital revolution, and my guess is we're many, many decades or a century away from figuring out what it looks like to have transitioned from a world that's mostly about atoms, which is what almost all of our ancestors through all of human history have known, physical, material stuff in place, to a world that's heavily driven by bits. And those bits are going to drive economic output bigger than anything the world has ever known. We're going to have more high-quality, low-cost stuff than anybody in all of human history. And yet, it seems strange that we could live at a time with the greatest material prosperity ever. Middle-class Americans are the richest people any time and place in all of human history. And yet, we have lots and lots of anxiety and discontent. And if you want to sort of make this precise about something that is closer to a news hook, we're going to have our third year of declining life expectancy this year in the US. We've never had this before. We didn't have good data on life expectancy during the Civil War. We probably had at least 3 years of declining life expectancy during the Civil War. But since we've been measuring things like this for a century, we've never had 3 years of declining life expectancy. And right now we have ramping deaths of despair. Overdoses, opioids, suicide, things like that have displaced car accidents, which on mortality tables from 80 years ago until 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, car wrecks were always the biggest driver of death, particularly among anybody under the age of 60 or 65. And now we're displacing those deaths with deaths of despair. That's a weird thing to be paired with so much material surplus. So I wrote this book to talk, part one, about the decline of the natural tribes, the good tribes, the tribes of place. We have a statistical collapse of the nuclear family, particularly among the 70% of Americans that have the least educational attainment. We have a rapid decline in friendship. I graduated high school in 1990. The average American had 3.2 friends in 1990. The average American today has 1.8 friends. I'm defining this again in an Aristotelian sense, somebody who loves you. It's not a transactional relationship. It's that if you see someone who's your friend and they're happy, you're happy. You don't choose to be happy, you just are because you love them. When my kids hurt, I have 17 and 14-year-old daughters and a 7-year-old boy. When one of my kids hurts, I don't choose to hurt. I just hurt because they're part of me. I love them, right? A great friendship is like that. It's like somebody in your family. We've had a halving of friendship in America in the last 27 years. At the level of work, we have rapidly declining average duration at a firm. Average duration at a firm in the 1970s, I was born in 1972, average duration at a firm for a primary breadwinner in the 1970s was 2.5 decades. Average duration at a firm for an American today is 4.2 years and getting shorter. What does that mean? It means it's much less likely that you have lifelong coworkers. Guess what? Males in particular are terrible at building new friendships after age 25. And so if you don't have the built-in chance to have coworkers that you just work next to on the assembly line for decade after decade after decade, it's incredibly unlikely that males replace relationships after 30, 35, 40, 45. And as we have more mobility in the economy, not for everybody, but as the economy becomes more mobile in a digital economy over time, a lot of males have this atrophy of relationships. When you ask middle-aged and older men who their best friend is, 60% of them say their wife. When you ask middle-aged and older women who their best friend is, 29% say their husband. There's a lot going on there. There are a whole bunch of culture war fights we have. I have a friend, a couple who live down the road from us in rural Nebraska, and the husband, who's a big stockbroker, is announced that he's retiring next year, and his wife's standard line is, oh no, he's gonna have twice as much time and make half as much money. But there's just so much about the way relationships develop over the course of life that when you don't have coworkers over life, it means you have less sense of a shared project, and we're meant for we. So all of these natural tribes are atrophying. That's part 1 of the book. Part 3 of the book is constructive stuff. What do we do about it? And hopefully in question and answer, you'll help lead us there. I want to focus for our 25 or 28 minutes that I'll consume before we get to question and answer together. I want to focus on the middle third of my book because it relates to being in a venue like the National Press Club and before an audience of people who are doing a job which celebrates the First Amendment. So the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: freedom of religion, speech, assembly, protest, and of course press. And so being in a place like this, I want to talk a little bit about the media, but not necessarily in the shorthand ways that we're used to talking about the media in our political discourse. I want to talk about it a little bit more broadly and look at some of the economics of our moment as well. So even though I don't usually speak from notes, I'm going to speed through 7 theses because I know we'll run out of time. And so I want to tell you my 7 theses that are about the rise of anti-tribalism, and particularly, I mean by that, not just political tribes, but news media consumption tribes. Because I believe there are really only 2 kinds of communities. When you think about what is a community, there are communities of place, and there are communities of idea. Do you sit next to somebody? Is your body near somebody else's body? Do you live in their neighborhood? Do you work at their workplace? Do you worship in the pew next to them? Are you sharing the same household with this person? There are communities of place and there are communities of idea. And because of the digital revolution through which we're living, communities of place are in collapse. We could spend lots of time, and hopefully if you haven't picked up the book, you will. I travel through a bunch of the data about what it means that place is being undermined in our time. But since humans are social animals, since we're relational animals, we need to be a part of tribes. We need to be a part of a group. We need to feel like there's a place where everybody knows your name and where you belong. And so if you have less place, you're likely to have more attempts to make community of idea. But it turns out almost all the economic incentives of our time to mediate distance. And so when I say media here, I mean something broader than just reporting. I mean the mediation of being a part of a community that isn't just people who live on the same block or work at the same workplace. When you mediate a distance between things, it turns out almost all of our economic incentives are to anti-tribe rather than constructive tribe. What are you against rather than what are you for? And so I'm going to give you 7 quick theses, then I'll go through them a little slower, and then when time gets called on me, hopefully I'll persuade you to I'll hopefully have said something provocative enough that you'll want to keep talking about it in question and answer. Thesis 1, there is no we in American media consumption today. There is no we in American media consumption today. The reduction of barriers to entry has meant we've gone from a world where almost everybody had a local newspaper and maybe a sense of one national newspaper or a regional newspaper and 3 broadcast channels to a world where barriers to entry have fallen so rapidly that today 93% of American households have access to 500 or more broadcast or cable channels. In that world, it means that almost everybody is a part of smaller, more fragmented audience niches, which means that the incentives, again, not every reporter does this, but the incentives inside media organizations are toward fan service, not pretending that you have a chance at speaking to a 70% audience. There are no 70% audiences. Almost everybody is writing or broadcasting for some subset of a 1% audience, and so almost all the economic feedback loops are toward an intensification of saying things that you presume your audience needs to hear or wants to hear. Number 2, my point that I made earlier, there's no such thing as a 24-hour news cycle. There is no such thing as, better said, there's no such thing as 24 hours of news that the media in America needs. Chyrons are lying to you. Before you even get to the question of whether or not the substance in the headline at the bottom of your cable news channel is true or false or accurate or biased, it isn't true that everything that's being shouted at us from cable news channels is breaking. Most of it is not breaking, and most of it isn't news that you need. Number 3, the obliteration of straight reporting versus editorial or commentary is a really big deal, and we don't pay nearly enough attention to it. We know that cable TV has been swallowing print for decades, but there would be an argument 15 or 20 years ago that perhaps the internet could foster a culture that returns to some of the virtues of print media, which is more deliberate is more dispassionate and is more amenable to thinking about that distinction between straight reporting and editorial or commentary.
Third of 4 panels. This is a highly distinguished panel. I just want to briefly introduce our panelists. We have David Cohen, former Deputy Director of the CIA, held a variety of jobs in the U.S. government, including the Treasury Department, but ended his career in the government at the CIA. Farah Pandit, the first ever special representative of Muslim community, served in both the Bush and Obama administrations at the State Department. And then Les Munson, who served at the U.S. International Agency for International Development, as well as most recently as my boss at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he was the staff
Very
director
traumatic.
Under, I'm sure it was, under then ranking member, then Chairman Bob Corker. So today we're going to talk about international institutions, our alliances, and the impact of this post-truth world and the challenges to rule of law on these alliances. So I thought I'd start with you, David. One of the things we often think about when we think of international institutions is we think of the core institutions, State Department, the UN, NATO, these traditional institutions. I know that there are these informal groups, the Five Eyes group, for example. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the impact of the modern era and sort of what we've seen over the last, not just the recent presidency, but the prior presidency, and this sort of change in discussions we've been having? What impact has that had on these more informal institutions?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, to NSI and YPO for inviting me to do this. So there are a whole host of informal institutions, alliances in the intel world that are enormous.
They're listening in now too.
That are enormously important because however powerful the U.S. intelligence community is, we are enormously enhanced in our ability by being able to share information with other intel agencies around the world. And I think probably the most important, and I think the intel alliance that most people have heard of, is this Five Eyes alliance.
Yeah. What is that?
So it is a quasi-formal, I would say, alliance of Great Britain, the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It's frankly, a somewhat odd collection of countries but it has been in existence for long enough that when it was first created, it made sense.
And it made sense because those were convenient places to collect intelligence.
And allies, and close allies with whom you would feel comfortable sharing. The concern about how an alliance like that operates in a post-truth environment, and frankly for other intel alliances, is that the idea of sharing intelligence has sort of embedded in it a high degree of trust.
Trust in what?
Trust that what you are being provided with from the other intel service is accurate, it's reliable, it's truthful.
So the concern is this new world that people won't be able to rely on us?
Because they can't rely on us, and to the extent that this slops over into how others approach the intel function, we can't rely on them because you can't get behind the intel that's being passed often. There's a threat coming from this person in that country. We're not going to share our sources and methods necessarily on how we're going to do that, although within the Five Eyes construct it's a little different. But generally speaking, you can't get underneath the information, and so you have to rely on it. You have to be able to trust the information.
So is the concern that the intelligence information might be being used for political purposes and therefore is less reliable? Is that the concern?
So I think the concern, but I think a slightly less pungent variety, which is that the concern that there may be some spin put on the ball for political purposes breeds a level of distrust in the system that can make the whole system much less effective.
So somebody asked about this earlier because people sometimes say, well, this is a problem with the current administration and the current structure, but similar criticisms were made by conservatives of the Obama administration when you were there, that the intelligence was being shaded to support, say, the Iran deal, for example, or there was a sort of a conversation being created in the. I mean, what is that? Is that a fair criticism? And if it's not a fair criticism, is that a similar concern?
So I would distinguish, so A, it's not a fair criticism, but B, I would distinguish.
To be fair, you were there at the time.
I was there, exactly. But totally unfair criticism. But I would also distinguish between the sort of domestic use of intelligence, which was, and I think the criticism was, for domestic purposes, the intel was being shaded to support the deal, as opposed to what I've been talking about, which is sharing with international allies, with other intelligence services. What concerns me, so I'm going to set aside the sort of domestic aspect of this for the time being. What concerns me about an environment in which there is a concern that grows about whether the information being passed, the intelligence being passed, is truthful, is accurate, or whether it's being spun for political purposes, makes this informal arrangement among allied intelligence services, or not so allied intelligence services, but with whom you share an interest, much less effective. Because at the end of the day, it is all dependent on this sort of blind faith, blind trust that what you're getting is real. And when that starts to weaken and to ebb, I think it's very hard to get that back.
Well, let me bring Farah and Les into this conversation. So Farah, one of the things that you write and think a lot about is this impact of counterterrorism operations, right? And the impact on counterterrorism efforts, particularly countering violent extremism of this post-truth world, right? What impact do the things that David just talked about, this sense that maybe our allies can't trust us, whether it's because one administration is saying stuff about a deal, or the other administration is saying stuff because they've got political purposes and they've got an agenda. What impact, if any, does it have on our efforts to counter violent extremism and terrorism?
So I want to thank you again for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I think it's really important what was just said around what is truth. And when we're looking at the populations of people that are most affected for terrorist organizations to in fact recruit, whether we're talking about ISIS or AQ or right now different types of extremism, we are looking at an ideology of us versus them. However you define it, that's what we're looking at. For the generation that's growing up, what does it mean to be truthful? I want us to understand how young these people are and how they're absorbing what is truth and what is not truth, not just what's on their device, but what they're absorbing in their day-to-day life. If you think that that's not going to make a difference to our national security and our bottom line, you're grossly mistaken. Because one of the things we don't do as government is to look at the cultural contexts in which young people are being raised, how they're absorbing their own truth, what their consciousness is. And I think that plays a huge role in the way in which we think about what alliances are and what we have to do to actually prepare for the future. Having said that, the other piece of this is, what you talked about in terms of formal alliances. How will it erode the way in which we think about the structures that we need to be able to stop the bad guys from doing what they're doing? One is certainly in the hard power space around what we have to do to make sure that the traditional military component is working. But in the space of the softer ideological war that we are fighting, it's already not going so well. We already are having problems getting a system working globally.
Why is it so
How much
hard
time
for
do
us
you
to
have?
win?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, this is and we should get into why the current environment makes it hard. But why is it so hard for us to win this war of ideas? I mean, clearly, right? We have it right. So why aren't we winning?
Do you believe that the United States government has gone all in fighting this off-power war?
No, but why haven't we? We've been talking about it since the beginning of the Bush administration, right? Right after 9/11, we said, this is a war of ideas. It's a war that we can't even necessarily win, that the Muslim world has to fight for itself, but we can empower moderate voices. Why aren't we doing it?
We've given a lot of words in speeches and at many, and this is not it's not about who was president. It's about our intent and our willingness to put the resources behind the ideas. Almost 20 years after 9/11, solutions are available and they are affordable. We don't have the will to actually do this, but in fact, no other country in the world has actually gone all in either. So
it's not just us.
So it isn't just us, but boy, oh boy, do I think we're leaders in this world. And do I think that we ought to make a grander effort to scale what we have used taxpayer dollars to do and fight the us and them ideology so that young people don't get recruited. Having put that all on the table, let me just go back to what that means for the young people out there who try to understand what truth is. The bad guys manipulate facts to make kids believe what they want you to believe. So what does truth actually mean? And this is a larger philosophical question that we could be asking. But it makes a difference for those of us who are in this space. All of you who are here today are obviously interested in national security. We aren't looking at that component of this. And when I think about the traditional alliances we have, I think about what will happen to them, but I also think about what's happening to millennials and Generation Z, which is, pick a subject, climate change, human rights. They're forming informal alliances. They're not waiting for the traditional alliances to do things to fight particular issues.
You mean on Twitter?
Not just on Twitter. It's the way in which they act. It's the way they organize their lives. They are not waiting for a hierarchical structure or a time in which they have to have gray hair to be able to do something.
Oh, they're organizing now.
They're organizing around themes and ideas, both online and offline. And I think those kinds of alliances are going to make a difference to the way we think about whether we're talking about CVE or we're talking about other things. So that is what I actually really think we ought to, as government, spend some time thinking about what that actually means.
I'm about to loop Les in, but before I do that, one of the things General Hayden talks about is this idea that the social media era is pushing all of us to our edges, right? We're all getting more extreme because we're circling ourselves with people that think like we do, or think more aggressively like we do, and we're being pushed to the perimeter. Right? Do you see that happening with young people? And if so, that's obviously deeply troubling in the extremism space. And if they're forming these informal alliances, whether it's online or in whatever manner, I mean, is that going to, are we in big trouble?
I wouldn't say. It depends on the issue. Are we in big trouble? On something like climate change, if America doesn't lead, it's a great thing that civil society and others are leading. Yeah. On the issue of extremism, if you're fighting back against the ideology of us versus them, and no government is leading, and you have civil society that are forming groups, that's a great thing. But if you take a more nefarious perspective on this whole thing, it's not so great if young people are learning from each other how to do bad things. And in the context of this past week in America, let me just be really clear to say that the extremists who are advocating a particular type of America that is defined by a race and a religion, they are learning from like-minded thinkers in other parts of the world, particularly Europe. So they're not forming formal alliances through the Five Eyes or something else. They're forming through connectivity around themes that make sense, and they're learning them mostly in an online space at the moment.
So what about that, Les? Les, you've served in at the agency at USAID. You served at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Should we really be worried about this sort of devolution of into these informal alliances and kids and extremists getting together online? And is this a real concern? And if it is our current environment making it better or worse? And if it's making it worse, what do we do?
Well, so many ways to answer that. How much time do we have? I don't think human nature is changing.
Okay.
I think we're basically the same construct we were a couple generations ago. We have new technology. We have easier ways to communicate. I think we need to kind of remember who we are as the United States of America. Yes, we have a government, but we are a government of the people. David, I know, can attest. He served in the administration. Now he doesn't. You and I served in an administration. Now we don't. You serve a government. The real source of power in this country is the people. We shouldn't have the arrogance to think that we should be manipulating our people or reining them in or constraining them in some way.
Even when they seem to have lost their way?
People will always lose their way. It's the nature of humanity. What we have that maybe other places don't quite have or don't have yet is freedom for our people to express themselves in a fair and reasonable way and in a way where there's accountability. So I think our young people, and I have two of them in my house who don't really agree with me on anything, feel free to have conversations and views, and they're much more mature, I think, than I would give them credit for to their face. But we should not be at all reluctant to embrace a world in which power is devolved to the people. That is the basis of our country. That is our strength. That is our sweet spot.
Okay, so this is interesting. So you said an important word. You said accountability, right? What about the fact that on Twitter today, there's limited accountability because you can be anonymous, you can be anybody, you can be a Russian bot or a real person, and say what you want about the president, right? The former or the current president, right? But they took responsibility for what they said. They may be, depending on where you sit, crazy, right, or wrong, but they took responsibility for the things they were saying. What about this anonymous speech? And let's think about one thing when you answer this question, Les, which is we have a long tradition of anonymous speech in this country going back to our founding. What about that?
There's a whole issue that people get very worked up about on campaign finance reform. Who's funding candidates? Who's funding political action committees? Who's funding various advocacy groups? Those are all important conversations to have. I personally think that a little bit of anonymity is occasionally okay, and that you shouldn't always have a star chamber. If someone wants to give a lot of money to a certain candidate, that's not always useful. But we're also developing, as we mature in the social media space, an understanding that it's the people who are willing to put their name next to what they say that matter, and that these bots are in fact bots and not super relevant. We're dealing with that challenge. Yes, it's a challenge. It's one we can deal with, and we are dealing with.
So I want to come to David about the bots, but Farrah, do you see this sort of anonymous speech issue being a problem when it comes to CVE and counterterrorism? Do you see young people being radicalized by anonymous speech, or is it speech they're looking for and want to go find, and then they move into the radical space?
Well, so let me be very clear. The only way you can make sure that young people don't find that ideology appealing is to make sure that the messaging and what they're hearing and observing is authentic and real and local to them.
So not less speech, but more speech.
It needs to be, yes, but it
more
needs
better
to be,
speech.
It needs to be authentic. It needs to be authentic speech to those peers who are actually confronting that.
Oh, it has to resonate with them.
It has to be authentic.
What does that mean?
That means that if you have some super secret person in the background putting those messages out, and those kids don't believe that what they're seeing is real, it's not going to work.
So it can't be QAnon.
I'm just saying.
Or the CIA.
I'm just saying that what we know almost 20 years after all of this has started is that in small pilot work that we have done, that the thing that sticks is when a young person buys into the person who's actually telling them something. And that's the only real thing that we know.
I think one of the smartest things my old agency, USAID, ever did was create kind of a Cuban Twitter several years ago. They got roundly criticized on the Hill for it by people who were a little more pro-Havana than the Bush administration was. But what a wonderful idea to actually give the Cuban people a way to express their own actual views and to share them with each other. That is something that we should be embracing.
Yeah, so David, what about that? Everyone talks about Iran. The president's all spun up about Iran. He's bailing out the Iran deal. It's all about to hit the front page the next week when we reimpose sanctions. But everyone says there's popular belief that the Iranian people are with us. It's just their horrible regime and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force and Qasem Soleimani. And if only the Iranian people could rise up. But why aren't we playing a blue jeans and rock music thing with the Iranian people? What are we doing wrong there?
So we are doing actually in Iran what Lester just described in Cuba, which is, as a general matter, there's a whole host of sanctions against, American companies doing things in Iran. There's an exception for social media, with the idea being that we're trying to facilitate the use of social media in Iran so that people can express themselves, can do in Iran what Lester was describing in Cuba. But can I go back to something that Lester said?
Sure, yeah, please.
So I want to actually pick up on Lester's household for a second. Which is that he's allowing his children to express themselves and all the rest. But Lester, as the head of the household, models.
I'm not sure his wife would agree, to be clear.
Or
his children, to be fair.
Right. But he models truthfulness. Right? He shows his children, this is the proper way to engage in debate and discussion. And I think that one of the real problems that we have, and we can do a whole bunch of is it with the last administration, this administration, but I think there is a searing lack of modeling good behavior at the top of our government household today. The government household, exactly. And I think that seeps down into our society. It seeps down into what people are doing in social media. And I worry that it seeps down into our government. And where you see, you can see it in governmental ethics. It's no surprise that there are any number of senior administration officials who are doing things that make you cringe if you have any modicum of sense about what you should, Ryan Zinke and flying on airplanes, all this crazy stuff that has never happened before. It happens. Let me finish. It happens because they're modeling what the president's doing, and I think the same is true in the public discourse, and I think in how our I'm worried that it's also how our government operates, because you see the president essentially getting away with it. It's this accountability question. And if he gets away with it, if he gets away with saying there are ISIS members in the caravan, or Congress is going to come back and do a tax cut before
Mexico's going to pay for it,
or Mexico's going to pay for the wall, it's it is utter BS. He knows it's utter BS, but he gets away with it. And I think one of the real things that we need to grapple with is accountability. It's cost. It is making it so that there is a incentive to tell the truth in the short term, because the long-term consequences are dire.
Okay, but so can I challenge you on that a little bit? And from two perspectives. One, the same criticism could be made of the Bush administration. Right after 9/11, we created an entire program, which we can now talk about as Stellar Wind, to conduct surveillance in the United States, with a substantial amount of American communications being collected. We kept it secret for the better part of 5 years, then ultimately a decade, right? And then the criticism of the Obama administration. The president wins the Nobel Peace Prize, less than a year into office. He doesn't tell the American people about the fact that he's negotiating with Iran, makes a deal, uses statutory authority that Congress didn't provide him for this purpose to get the deal done. I mean, the same criticism isn't the sort of what you describe as the problem with the leadership at the top. Couldn't the argument be made that that is a reflection of the way the American people, as Les said, we're ultimately people that voted for President Trump, whether you believe by enough margin or popular vote versus electoral college. But he's elected. I don't think anybody questions whether he was elected by our process. You might question the process. So isn't part of that a reaction to what came before? And if that's the case, then don't the American people have a right to be concerned? And maybe they're okay with a post-truth world because that's what they saw coming at them for decades, for the better part of a decade, under President Bush and President Obama.
No.
I knew that was the answer. I knew that was going to be the answer.
I think so. I would, and Farah was getting into a little bit on sort of the typology of truth. And so let me just posit something here, which is way too simplistic, but I think from my simplistic mind works. There is objective truth. So like climate change. Like you can debate all the rest about what's the cause, but the fact the climate is changing is an objective truth. And I think you see alliances, institutions forming to deal with something that is a undeniable truth. So I put that in one bucket. And the second bucket is logical, deductive reasoning based on facts. Okay. What
the facts mean.
What the facts mean. And you can have reasonable disagreement on how what your logic train is and where you conclude, but you're beginning with facts and you have...
That everyone agrees on.
Everyone agrees on, you have a logical, and your logic is transparent. Yeah. What worries me about the world we're in is, I think and again, this is overly simplistic, but I think in the Bush world, the Obama world, there were a whole host of fair disagreements about that second category, about, here's what we know about the Iranians, does it make sense or not make sense to do the nuclear deal? I think what the problem that we're facing today is in that first bucket, where there is objective reality that is either being denied or being or falsehoods being manufactured. And that's where I think the danger lies for governance, and I think it's where institutions that depend on an approach where people are faithful to objective reality begin to weaken. And that's where my concern was.
So Farah, one of the criticisms of the State Department where you served is that there's sort of a deep state. There's all of these bureaucrats and career government individuals who are sort of undermining the political agenda of the president. And this has, by the way, been criticism made in Republican administrations for a long time. Is that a real concern? And if it is, what impact, if any, does or is this sort of question about whether you're telling the truth or shading the facts, even as David has described them, is that okay if you're facing a deep state where you have no choice but to respond in kind? Is this just a response in kind, or is it something different?
So our government has been around for a while, right? We have civil servants and we have foreign service officers at AID, at state, in various ways across our government. So this is not something new that there are people there who have committed their careers to serving our nation, to upholding the Constitution. Every single one of us, when we served, had to put our hand up and put our other hand on, we made a pledge to be truthful, to defend the Constitution. That's what you do when you become a public servant. And it goes back to what you were just saying about leadership and really about public service, period. There are complexities in the world that we live in here in the interagency. We try to push things forward, they get pushed back, they get manipulated, things don't go as fast. That's the nature of the bureaucracy that we have here. It's not unique to America, it is where we are. But the fundamental piece around doing what is in the Constitution and the red lines that allow us to navigate are essential. And I also will say that in sort of modeling good behavior, this piece that was brought out, I think it is really important to think about two big changes that have happened within the State Department. And I don't know the numbers on AID, having worked there twice, I should know. But the fall off of people who are interested in serving our nation, what that actually will mean if they don't have any belief that you can actually just be a public servant without a hardcore position on one thing or another, that you can go forward as for decades past that we have done. And then two, those that are in the system today, understanding a different reality, how is that actually going to impact us 20 years from now when they have risen to a place where they have even more power than they have? And I think a lot about that, because I think about my own career serving as a political appointee, mind you, for a Republican and a Democrat. I think I'm one of the only people to have done that through Bush and Obama as a political. And for me, how lucky it was to be around people who were honorable, who were dedicated to the Constitution, who were public servants. You model your behavior on the ethical standard that they put forward. If you're a young person navigating through the State Department today, what are you looking at? And I don't know, because I haven't been in state in this administration, so it's unfair for me to say what it feels like. But I think there's a larger issue here, which goes to the question you're talking about. Truth can always be what piece of the way in which we talk about it in public has been manipulated, but the facts, the things that are actually facts, the sun is shining, we believe those things cannot be manipulated. And I think we haven't spent enough time as a nation, and those of us within the interagency, coming back to the basics and talking about public service in terms of what it actually means to be a public servant and why you would ever enter into the field of public service if you don't believe that your primary responsibility is to defend the Constitution, to be honorable, and to represent, as you said, this incredible American diverse group of people.
So Les, what about that? What about both the politicals and the careers at institutions like state or FBI or DOJ, where at least if you believe the public narrative, which I think is fair and true, that they're under deep criticism, under attack from the top, is the right thing to go in and serve and sort of fight the power? Is the right thing to go in and serve and salute and do what the president says because he's the leader of the executive branch? Or is the answer somewhere in the middle and sort of try to stave off the crazy, right? And sort of, as the anonymous author of that op-ed said, is I'm trying to stop the insanity, and play into what is sort of the deep state narrative.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the op-ed you're talking about, the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times from a couple months ago, which seemed to be written by John McCain. And then he got somebody to submit it. That's my personal theory. I don't know if it was a great idea to publish it, but the message in it, I think, resonates.
You just told us you liked anonymous speech.
Sorry?
You just told us you liked anonymous speech on occasion.
I do, absolutely.
But not that one.
Yeah. No, the message is very good.
All right.
But did it help the cause of the people who I think are in the administration or are trying to do the right thing and kind of curtail the crazy and keep it between the guardrails? I don't think it really helped that mission to publish it out to public.
Oh, because now the president knows and he's going to react.
Yeah, perhaps. But the message is not wrong, and I think that's true of a lot of the folks who are serving the administration. I also think we should not take too seriously the rhetoric of the president. We need to pay attention to it. We need to be mindful of it. He's putting on a show that is meant to get ratings and is meant to irritate people, or to entertain them, or to give them joy. That's the purpose of his shtick, I think. So while a lot of it concerns me, I think the whole deep state argument is not a super serious argument for how to run a government. Those of us who have served in these agencies and departments know there's always kind of a little bit of tension between the politicals and the career folks, no matter what party is in charge. And it's always difficult for the politicals to kind of get the careers to adopt the current really important agenda of this administration, because gosh, we're going to be here for 3 more years and we better get this done. Of course, they're going to be here for 15 more years and are going to have to survive in other administrations. So I don't put a lot of worry into the whole deep state question. Getting back to this question of truth and objective truth, I think that's a great discussion to have. I think clearly we have an administration where it's okay to exaggerate and lie and make stuff up to make your point, and people should be called to account for that, and they are, and we should keep doing that, and we should all participate in that. But one thing we should be very careful not to do, I think, that is all too easy to do today, is assume that we know the motives of the people we're talking about, or that we know where their heart is, or that we know what they're thinking, that we know the explanation for their behavior. We should let people explain for themselves why it is they're saying certain things. We should not assume that they are racists. We should not assume that they are socialists or communists. We should not assume they're trying to destroy the United States of America. We should stop saying those things unless it is very clear that that is objectively true.
Well, so let's talk about that. Because since you brought up your household, I'm going to bring up my household. So, you say the president's putting on a show. It's part of the ratings thing. It's not really. It might not be substantive. We can just sort of ignore it and try to get to the real heart of things. But in my own household, when the president was the nominee, or before he became the nominee, he talked about the Muslim ban, right? My son, who's a little white kid, but he knows he's Muslim, right? Came up to me, 6 years old, and says, "Daddy, if Donald Trump gets elected, do we have to leave the country?" My son asked me that, right? And I guess the question is, forget my family, forget my son, but doesn't that sort of conversation, truth or not truth, whatever it is, Mexico's going to pay for it, right? There are dark people in the caravan or whatever. There are ISIS members in the caravan, right? Doesn't that have a corrosive effect on our own institutions, but also on our international relationships and alliances?
Yeah, of course it does. Yes, absolutely.
So can't we just not pawn it off as well? It's just the president being the president. No, but just let Trump be Trump.
Let's put it in context. It is not good for him to be saying those things. They are not helpful to our country. They're not helpful, frankly, to parts of his agenda. It's very destructive. On the other hand, let's take the example of the deep state. I don't think this administration is actually trying to destroy the civil service or the foreign service specifically. They may have different views about what exactly to do on certain policy issues, but I don't think they're actually out to destroy what the deep state would actually be constituted of. So we need to be careful in our reaction to what he's saying to keep it in the zone of what's actually material and what's at stake.
Okay.
And I think we talked about this about your son when this was going on, and I'm completely sympathetic, and it's one of the reasons I find this administration so disturbing. But we should be honest about that aspect of it, that this is not rhetoric that is welcoming to all Americans, and it should stop, and we should go in a different direction.
David, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I just wanted a two-finger on this. If you don't have any faith that something truthful is being said in a time of non-crisis, What the heck are we going to do when there is a crisis? That's what I'd like to know.
No, it's
So,
important.
so I want to pick up on that and then make a broader point. So I was thinking about it, going back to the intelligence community example, and thinking about this caravan, and the sort of utter BS about who is in this caravan. Compare that to, I think it was in 2011, when there was the plot against the Saudi ambassador here.
Yeah. Cafe Milano.
There was going to, this guy Arbab Siar was going to blow up Adel al-Jaber in Cafe Milano. That was and it was the Iranians who were behind it, and they were coming through Mexico, right?
So real terrorists in a caravan.
Real terrorists, not in a caravan, but coming through Mexico, and we relied on the belief that we could go to the Mexicans and say, there is a honest to God, real life bad guy in your country coming here, and we need your help. They helped us. That guy got picked up. Everything turned out fine. You were talking, or Les was talking about corrosive effect. There is a corrosive effect of saying that there are, honest to God bad guys in a caravan.
Because the next time when it's
the
real,
next time it's Aesop's fable, right? I mean, it's the boy who called wolf. There's millennia about talking about the corrosive effect of lying. It has an impact, and that's the broader point that I want to make is. We talked about sort of the idea of America, USAID, doing work around the world, diplomacy, all this rest. There is and I firmly believe this, and I've seen it in having the privilege of being able to interact with folks around the world in the jobs I have, that there's an idea of America that it stands for something different than the totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian authoritarian regimes out there. And one of the essential elements is that it's truth, justice, and the American way, right?
Truth comes first.
Truth comes first. If we don't model truth from the highest echelons of this government, that has a palpable impact on how the world perceives us, how other governments perceive us, how people who we're trying to encourage to work with us perceive us. It has an impact. It isn't just a ratings game. It is real life, and it makes a difference, and it isn't necessarily tangible in the immediate instant, but in the long run, it harms our national security.
All right, I want to start in opposite order, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. So, Les, if you had one 80,000-foot big picture potential fix for some of the challenges we've identified, and then one 10,000-foot at the State Department, at AID, things that you could sort of do tomorrow to fix these things, but you're on the spot. What do you got? And then Farah and David, this question's coming to you too.
Glad you went to him first.
Gosh. If I were, 80,000 foot, I'm a Republican. I might find a U.S. senator to insinuate himself with the president to the point where he gets appointed to the cabinet. And then
could they play golf together?
Subvert the administration from within.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone's trying to do that or not. Maybe someone who was more of a McCainiac a couple of years ago might be doing that. Maybe my 80,000 foot strategy. My 10,000 foot strategy would be to stop with the ridiculous budget submissions that attempt to zero out various foreign aid programs. Let's stop with the pretending that
plays
we're going to
well,
cut
though.
a third.
It plays well with the president's base.
Yeah, but he's getting that vote anyway, and it's not real, and we should stop doing that. The president, whoever he or she is, needs those tools to be able to conduct American foreign policy properly. They should stop coming out with those ridiculous budgets. That's my 10,000 foot.
Farah, 80,000 foot, 10,000 foot.
So I'm going to be very annoying. Look. I'm a practical person. We have half of the administration has gone through. I'm looking forward, okay? I think you have to look, we didn't talk about the private sector, and I want to talk about that for just a moment.
Yeah.
I think that the leadership vacuum around moving forward on some critical ideas can happen through social good. and companies, and I'm not talking about CSR, by the way. I'm talking about a larger movement that is happening within.
We have CEOs in the room, so this is the audience to talk to.
That's why I'm telling you this.
Very young CEO.
There is a new moment in time in America and around the world for businesses to take on a different value system, and we don't have enough time to get into all of it. So what I would say for that big fix is the next generation of CEOs working directly with civil society organizations to move forward on a series of really important things to make change.
And it's not just cutting a check.
No, absolutely not. And on the immediacy of who we are as Americans, which I'm changing your question, but that's how I look at it. I really believe that there should be a Marshall Plan around the issue of civics and who we are as Americans that integrate both American history and a consciousness around democracy and our Constitution. I think we have lost a generation.
Marshall Plan at home.
At home. Oh. And I think we need to start now.
David, it's a tough road to hoe. You're coming up last, then we go to the audience for questions.
I absolutely cannot improve on that. So what I will do instead is I will second your first point about the importance of the private sector stepping up and playing a role. There are gaping holes in our current society of leadership. You see some business leaders taking that mantle. I think there's a lot of open field here for business leaders to get involved and not to get involved in a way where they need to make a decision between their bottom line and social responsibility, but where those things merge, and to understand that and to pursue it. And my 10,000 foot suggestion is vote. Get the hell out and vote. Get your friends to vote. Get everybody. Get your kids to vote. Vote multiple times. That's a vote.
He's a Democrat, so there you go. Just kidding. Yeah. Well, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm sorry we limited the amount so much, but we want to give you a 5-minute break. So I see a question right there at the back.
Hi, Andrea Kaplan. I always say, where's the United in the United States? Everything is a partisan issue, and that is we talk about the culture of the institution. That is the message we are sending to the younger generation. If they watch anything on TV, whatever the Democrats like, the Republicans don't, and vice versa. So within our own country, we're setting a really bad role model, as we say we need to show. We also talk about words like truth, fact, integrity. I believe at some point those words did have a real definition. Now everyone has their own definition. If a glass is half full or half empty, it's fact. It's both. So how do we define what those words really mean so we have a platform that we can actually operate on? How, I agree with you, Farah, civic, in education, in school, this needs to be discussed. What is right and wrong? And if at the adult level it's not being done, how are we teaching our younger generations?
So Farah, you've played a role in both these places. You've served in both a Republican and a Democratic administration, and I was just taking a naked punch out of David, not intentionally. But what do you make of both this, the bipartisanship question, the question of how to convince people that truth is a value that needs to be treasured?
So I really appreciate what you said and how you said it. So thank you for saying that. I really, it means a lot to think about that word united and how can we explore that as a nation. But can I just take it a little bit more broadly? One of the things, there's a bio somewhere. I worked on countering violent extremism since 9/11 onward for both administrations, the soft power ideological fight. And what I know is that is not a Republican issue and it is not a Democratic issue. It is an issue for humans all over the world to stop young kids from getting recruited. And so when I went about doing what I did, I wasn't looking at it from one political perspective or the other. And I say that because what I know, when you're able to find that common unified goal, people melt down and they begin to work together on that thing, fighting hate. Whatever that thing is, we can find a way. But it's the articulation of how we do this. So I would say to you, not only do government people need to speak about these things in a different way, but parents and teachers and community members need to talk about it in a different way. Kids are going to reflect in that way. And that brings me to my second point. In my role as special representative to Muslim communities, I traveled to nearly 100 countries. on behalf of our nation. And it is an incredible thing to think about, the numbers of millennials globally who are getting this toxic us versus them and not having any recourse. And I don't want to leave us on a negative note. I want to really focus on the positive, because in that exploration, through these conversations at a local level, I saw light, I saw hope, I saw the capacity for local communities to make a difference. And that's where I'd answer your question. How do we make sure that at a local level, your own local level, I mean, your neighborhood, what are you doing to make sure, and I'm not trying to sound like Pollyanna here, but when you start at a nano level, it can move into a macro and a mega, and it can actually make a difference. So that's my answer for your question. And if one of your CEOs here in this room wants to get on board with the Marshall Plan for America, let's do it together.
Right. Okay, I saw a question over here in the middle somewhere. Somebody right there, ma'am, yes?
Hi, thank you everyone today. My name's Suzanne Nash. I'm probably one of the rare people in this room that has had family here. I'm a native. My mother's side of the family has lived here for over 150 years. So my grandmother was a suffragette. I actually almost came in costume today because I got to help get ready later. In my family, civic participation is something that's discussed because it's just a given. It's everyone in one generation or another has worked in civil service somewhere, be it the local government or levels of the federal government. What I find shocking, I guess because it's part of my DNA at this point, is that so many adults, much less younger generation and children, don't really get the idea of civic participation. And I love the idea of the Marshall Plan. It's been something I've been bouncing around in my head. I will email you later because I really would like to bring it to my kids at school. How do we, as parents, help our kids become a beacon for getting those ideas out to their peers and friends? Because I'm doing that with my own children, but we're like not normal. So anyhow, it's something I would love to bring to my kids at school. I'm on the board, and I think this is a great idea. Thank you.
It's a great concept, this idea of a beacon or a city on a hill. Yeah. David, thoughts?
No, I think that's right. And look, I'm going to actually pick up on that first question and this one also, what Leslie was saying about the civil service and the deep state and all the rest. I think one of the encouraging things that you can convey to folks about the United States of America and an optimistic viewpoint is there are in the civil service people who work in Democratic or Republican administrations. Just for the record, I actually worked in a Republican administration when I was a civil servant.
To be fair.
Okay. But these folks, so I've seen them at Treasury, and I saw them at the CIA, in large number. People who take their oath to the Constitution, to the country, not to any particular president, and they're still there. And by and large, they're not undermining the president. They're doing the policy implementation for this president as they did for the prior one, and they'll do for the next one. And I think we understandably focus on the president and the cabinet and the crazy, but this country still works, and it still works largely because we have people in the civil service who dedicate themselves to working for this country. And so I think that's something that you can convey to your kids about something they can hold on to that's good and true in this world. And I think it is. I imagine my co-panelists agree with me on that point.
So we'll take one last question. Sir, here in the front. Right here. Coming up. All right.
Hi, my name is Alex Miller. I must say, I think I need to say that I'm an independent because in this age, I think it adds some modicum of understanding about why I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And that is, I agree with you, sir, that I think a great amount of what our current president does is shtick. The only thing I've been able to determine that he's actually serious about is his own place in. I'm speaking.
It may not be picking up well. Apologies. I'll repeat it. Just go ahead and say it, Admiral, and I'll repeat it.
Test.
There you go.
All right, thank you. So the only thing that I've been able to determine that the current president is serious about is his own position in life and liberty and his pursuit of happiness. That's an opinion. And I'm an independent. But I'm very concerned about, as many of you all are, as I think many of the nation are, the division that's in our country. And I believe the shtick is creating a situation where it's polarizing that division. Again, I don't think I've said anything that a thinking person hasn't noticed or is obvious. I've had a chance to, I'm sure there are people who are uneducated through their fault of their own or no fault of their own, are not very smart through no fault of their own or their own fault, on both sides of the aisle. But I've had occasion, as many of us have, to watch those that I feel fall into that category on the Republican side. And I'm very concerned that the shtick is polarizing some of these people who can't think critically, who may be undereducated, ill-educated, or stupid. And I don't know where this is going to lead to those people. Clearly, it's been in the news. Again, I'm not saying anything that probably hadn't crossed your thoughts also this week. Did we see some examples of that this week? I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps. And I'm just wondering if anybody wants to comment about that.
So Les, you get the last word on this, since you and I are the designated Republicans on this panel, and we're you know, what about that? The shtick, the sort of the base, potentially concerns about their education.
I think it's a totally fair concern, and it's hard, it would be really hard to refute the notion that the shtick had something to do with the recent events. How indirect, I don't know, but it's hard to refute that, and I would concede that up front. In terms of, what can people do? I'll end with by going totally micro. My son plays on a basketball team at his high school, and one of the other parents, who we're very friendly with, is on the other side of the aisle from me. And she and we became friends because of our kids were friends and teammates. And about a month ago, she emailed me and said, "Can we get coffee? I'm really worried about the direction of our country, and I want to talk to someone who doesn't agree with me on every single point, just to have the conversation." And I thought, well, this is amazing. Let's go do this. So we went to the little coffee shop in the strip mall by our houses, and we sat there for 2 hours, past the time we were both obliged to go somewhere else, talking about racism, about bigotry, about the state of the economy, about politics, about the fact that we didn't agree on various things, and then the rather substantial number of things we did agree on. It was just the two of us talking, friends, but people who didn't, I'm sure we never, well, probably didn't, maybe occasionally we voted the same way. It was an incredible conversation. I mean, there's no reason everyone can't do that. Yes, there is division in this country. Be someone who isn't being divided. Talk to someone who disagrees with you. It doesn't have to be someone, it could be someone who looks just like you, but disagrees with you. That's the critical thing, that you're able to talk to someone who isn't coming from the same place you are. And that's the real unity. We shouldn't all agree on everything. We're always going to disagree about issues, but we should always be able to talk to each other.
Right, on that note, thank you very much.
So nice to be on the panel with you. It's a pleasure.
There will be refreshments around the corner. Give us about 5 minutes and we'll be on to our next panel. Thank you.
Yeah.
So a brief break here in the Security Forum addressing some of the threats to democratic institutions and to freedom in the United States. This is hosted by George Mason University in Virginia. Up next, we're expecting remarks from Bill Crystal, Frank Sesno, and journalist Josh Rogan of The Washington Post. This is live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
right-handed,
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for staying through the full day. We're about to get started with our last panel on the post-truth press. So if everyone would begin taking your seats, that would be great.
Tough. It's going to be impossible.
Alrighty, if everyone would take your seats, we're about to get started with our last panel of the day. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Lauren Claffey. I am a fellow at NSI and also a former official at the Department of Homeland Security, so welcome. Very happy to have you. I won't introduce our distinguished guests because pretty much everybody knows them from TV or other things that they've done over the years. But this panel, there's been a lot of focus on, I think, rhetoric in the previous panels, and we'll get to that for sure, I think, in the latter part of this panel. But with the state of media and the way it's changed over the past 15 years, we want to really kind of discuss, I think, the way it's changed and the way that it's viewed as a distributor and validator of information in today's environment. And so with that, I'll just go ahead and kick it over to Frank. And yep, I'm just going to surprise you on this one and let you kind of go into what you think about the state of media today and the way that it's changed over the past 20 years or so, and the challenges in journalism right now as a validator of information.
Everything's fine. Never been better. No, look, I think that this is a very serious issue, and it's one that has a huge amount of complexity associated with it. The first mistake that people make, to include the President of the United States and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, is to use the word media as a singular word. It is one of the most plural words in our vocabulary. And so, for example, the other day when she said from the podium after the horrors in Pittsburgh that the first thing the president did was to condemn the attacks, the first thing the media did was to blame the president, is absolutely flat wrong on two accounts. First of all, there is no the media, and who is she talking about? And secondly, the first thing that virtually everyone I know in the media did was to report the story. So where has the media gone? I joined CNN when CNN was 4 years old. It was a baby network, still referred to as Chicken Little News. We did not have access. We did not have an audience to speak of. The country was being cabled. But we quickly saw how this was going to revolutionize the information experience because it created the opportunities for people to watch events from around the world in an unfiltered way. That was the first time that had ever happened. And that was significant. But since that time, the cable dial has come along and gotten very crowded. The digital dial has come along and gotten very crowded. The social media dial has come along and gotten horrifically crowded. And the disinformation business has turned into an industry. And so the audience is much more fragmented than it's been before. It is being bombarded. It has less brand loyalty. The brands themselves are much weaker. When we talk journalism, we can't talk journalism without talking where the crisis is really the worst, which is at the local and regional level. All right? You're the Des Moines Register or the Hartford Courant or whatever. The economics have imploded, the staff has disappeared, and people, when they see journalism in their own neighborhoods and communities, don't see it anymore. That has undermined confidence to journalism more broadly. But perhaps, and I could go on for hours on this because this is something I wake up in the middle of the night and think about, which tells you something about my life, but perhaps the biggest single change has been this kind of rush to argument and opinion that has now really overtaken so much in the media. When CNN first went on the air, I was both a White House reporter, I was an anchor. We would bring Bill Kristol on. I would interview Bill Kristol one-on-one. I'd ask him about the president, the vice president, whoever it was, the proposal, where it comes from, what the politics are, how we're going to pay for it. Now if Bill Kristol comes on, Josh comes on, you come on, and I have 10 other people, and you get 3 seconds in there if we're talking the cable world now. And it's mostly, it goes right to the debate. It goes right to the opinion. I wrote a memo when I was bureau chief to my reporters, and I said, when you are doing live shots, please try to avoid 2 words. This is a true story. This is true. Please try to avoid the words, I think. Because the audience actually doesn't care what you think. The audience cares what you know, what you've seen, what you can report, what you've heard. Be the eyewitness. Don't be the judge. Let the jury be the judge. That probably is one of the most significant changes. There are excellent efforts out there to provide the transparency and the explanation to the public that the public needs in this environment. A lot of it is actually happening at the Post. I think the Post is really doing a terrific job. If you go, I think your pieces, do you have perspective over your, no. So like Margaret does, so she has the word perspective. If you hover over perspective, a little thing drops down and explains what perspective is. The Post tries to distinguish between, news, opinion, editorial, and explain on an ongoing basis, which I think is what needs to be done now because the audience is so confused. On the disinformation front, as I said, it's an industry, and this is going to get a lot worse as deep fakes and some other things come along that are designed even more to confuse and to anger and to radicalize.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch back on the misinformation and disinformation campaigns that go on both domestically and from foreign actors. But first I want to touch on what you discussed a little bit and ask Bill to chime in about the fractured environment and the audience-specific nature of a lot of our media today, where really you have the publications catering to a very specific audience because that's what's driving their ad revenue. And you started the Weekly Standard, I don't know how many years ago,
95.
Yeah, 95. So it was kind of at the cusp of that conservative revolution. But what's your perspective around the way that targeted news has changed?
Let me first, before answering that difficult question, address the elephant in the room, which is Halloween, obviously. And I'm amazed that so many people are here as Halloween's about to fall, but maybe you're here for the same reason I am, which is to avoid it. It's like I told my wife I was on this panel and it was end around 4:30, and she said, well, you can probably get back for the trick-or-treaters, around 5 or whatever. I said, no, I have to stay for the reception. Very important, be very rude to leave too quickly, and then probably have to have a bite with someone,
See, I have to get home because we have about 400 trick-or-treaters come to our door.
Is that right?
If I don't go back, my wife will not let me home again, ever.
Well, my wife's
part of the reason why I live in an apartment complex. You can just avoid it altogether.
You can. I grew up in New York City. We used to go up, and this is kind of a pathetic New York City apartment story. We used to go up and down the elevator trick-or-treating, because that's what you do if you live in an apartment. I guess not anymore, right? Well, where you live, probably it's all,
That's what doormen are for.
Yeah, I guess. Anyway, it's good to be here. What was the question again? I mean, I don't know. There's so many things that have happened at once in the last 20 years, technological, economic, political, international, that it's a little hard to disentangle, obviously, what's causing what, and what has a slight feeling that it's a perfect storm in certain ways. You have a sort of unusual, I would say, heightened politics for various reasons, more intense, more fraught, more divisive, and a media that's fragmenting, and social media, huge technological changes, which really I think we haven't seen the end of, as Frank sort of suggested, and we've not fully come to grips with. It's not easy to come to grips with them, just in terms of the actual technology of news, and the economics of news. So everything changing at once has really created a situation. Now, maybe we're just like everyone in the middle of one of these moments, and people are sort of frustrated and anxious and thinking the world's coming to an end, and then 20, 30 years later, people look up and say, you know what, the society's functioning, and maybe it's even functioning better because of these different opportunities. I think that's a plausible argument. Everyone thought TV was going to destroy culture in the 50s and 60s. In fact, I just did a conversation with a guy who teaches at UVA, Paul Cantor. It's very interesting on this. To absolute conventional wisdom, but I mean very high-level conventional wisdom, fancy PhDs in social theory, and then just down to the chairman of the FCC. TV is an idiotic medium, can never do anything good. It's going to destroy high culture. And of course now TV, because of different technological changes partly, and cable and the ability to have, 60-hour programs or whatever, like Breaking Bad, arguably has some of the best cultural, actually high-level artistic content. He's a guy who teaches Shakespeare at UVA, and he thinks some of the shows are at the same level as, certainly the great movies of the past that we now look back on nostalgically, and even real literature. So, not that that's a perfect analogy, but the internet I was hopeful about in the sense that I really did think when I went to college, you depended on whatever. There weren't many columnists and op-ed writers. You certainly couldn't get newspapers apart from the one that was published in or the 2 or 3 that were published in your city. Maybe the New York Times was really the one national paper. The Journal had almost nothing in opinion and commentary, or really almost news coverage in those days. And you couldn't just go online and read 6 intelligent comments about what had happened with Saudi Arabia, and you couldn't read Josh, and you couldn't read the reporting, and you couldn't read Elliot Abrams from this side of the spectrum and someone else from that side of the spectrum, and click on an interview with Mike Hayden on CNN. And that is pretty good. We shouldn't lose sight of that baby in the otherwise fairly scuzzy bathwater that we're living in. And that's not fake. I mean, that really is happening. I find this with students often. They're extremely well informed about a lot of things. And debates can be done at a pretty high level pretty quickly. And you can learn a lot pretty quickly. I don't know much about large parts of the world. There's a crisis in one of them. There's an actual U.S. policy debate. Now, of course, what one learns is always a little superficial and whatever's most, maybe, from whoever's most prominent at the time. But still, it's better than the old days when you really depended on, some alleged experts telling you things, and you got either 22 minutes of news from ABC, CBS, and NBC, which means you got 90 seconds on that topic, or whoever the particular commentator was in the Times or the Post or the 2 or 3 in the news weeklies, and maybe they were wrong. I mean, there are reasons, you could argue that the modern media makes a mistake or a process like Vietnam much less likely. For example, if you read H.R. McMaster's book, which is really a wonderful book, Dereliction of Duty, about the decision-making in Vietnam, leave aside the media stuff, which is also interesting that Halberstam and others have written about, but it does seem to me there are certain ways in which the accountability, the checks on real foolishness, the ability to challenge theories of, and so forth is a good thing. So I do want to mention that because we're also alarmed, understandably, about the partisanship, the divisiveness, the effect of social media, that we maybe forget the upside. I do think it's a little bit a final point, too much fatalism. You don't have to chase clickbait. The economics are tough, but the Weekly Standard's been going for 23 years, and we don't do what some others do, and some other magazines on the right have done, and maybe they're making a little money or they're losing less money than we are. But of course, there are other models than a profit-making model. Universities in the United States don't make money. They decided to depend on tuition, but really on philanthropists to a large degree, right? The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the opera, et cetera. That's not a crazy model for the media. There's no reason people couldn't do that, and that presumably would insulate you a little bit from the clickbait thing. So maybe a little more, maybe we're in a transition where, as you say, the Hartford Courant and the Des Moines Register, and it is a real crisis in local news, incidentally, because if you think the coverage of Congress has declined in the last 25 years, look at the coverage of your state legislature and those places, and City Hall, and those places are not filled with paragons of virtue and integrity necessarily. And so there used to be some oversight, if there were 7 newspapers covering, I think Jimmy Warren, who was in Chicago, says that when he began, there were 23 reporters regularly covering the Capitol, the Springfield, Illinois state politics, and now there are 3. And even with the 23 reporters, all the governors are in jail, so maybe that's why they're in jail on the other hand. So I think maybe we're in a sort of transition where we come out better the other way. The one thing that I think is really hard to get one's head around is social media and disinformation. I think that is a new thing. I mean, it's not, we've had propaganda before, we've had psyops before, we've had disinformation before, obviously. We've had intelligence and counterintelligence efforts before, but the ability to do it, as we saw just a glimpse of really in 2016, the immediacy of it, the ability, it's obvious, the different scale on which it can be done, the ease with which it can be done, both intentionally by Russia and others, and let's call it unintentionally or organically. Some false report of something pops up somewhere, it gets spread by people let's just say for a minute, credulously who believe it, or a mixture of people who believe it and partisans who want people to believe it, but there's no one source like Russia. And suddenly it's all over the place, and it's spread on Facebook, and it's spread in other ways, and websites pop up, and that is, I think, that phenomenon, I think, is a hard one to come to grips with.
Josh, I'll just kick that over to you to respond to, being active at the Washington Post right now and reporting. What are you seeing as some of the corrupting forces in journalism and, the problems or challenges that you have in validating information that you're getting and everything else? Just everything that you're dealing with right now.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me at this conference. I'm honored to be here. I've been working journalist now for about 15 years. And I came into the business working for the Asahi Shimbun Japanese newspaper in their Washington, D.C. bureau. And I remember, because that was when the internet was just sort of taking over journalism. Nobody knew what to do about it. And over those 15 years, I've seen nothing but chaos in the journalism industry. It's just all I know. So for journalists of my generation, the fact that the journalism business is in chaos, that the technology is disruptive, that's just the way we were brought up, okay? And that's not something new, that's just something that we've been forced to navigate. So I remember for the first few years I was doing this, it was all about, the internet was all about, oh, we'll build beautiful web pages, and if we put the headline here, and we put the picture there, and then we put the drag down menu here, it's gonna be wonderful, people are gonna come to it every day, and they're gonna love it. And that persisted for a couple of years, all right? And then it switched to what I call the search model, right? It was like, oh, now we have Google and web crawler and Lycos, and if we just put the right keywords in the headline and at the very top of the article and a bunch of tags and this and that, then people will go to these search engines, and then they'll find our articles, and we'll get a bunch of traffic, and everything will be okay. Then it switched to social, which was like, oh, okay, now it's what can be shared, and what do people want to pass on to their trusted filters, and and in each stage of this evolution, your journalism process has to change because, if you're writing for a beautiful web page, you're writing for an editor. If you're writing for a search engine, well, you're writing for an algorithm. If you're writing for social, okay, well, now we're writing for people, and we're trying to access what people care about. And it changes your process, and it changes your priorities, and it changes your choices. It's just natural. So that worked for a couple of years. Then we got to this era of super platforms, right? That's just like Facebook and like just all of the incentives were directed towards doing what these companies wanted, which often made no journalistic sense at all. I remember I was at one company and they were like, oh, we're doing 15-minute personal web videos. And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody wants to watch it. Don't worry, Facebook's going to pay us, right? So the incentives changed again. And so now we're sort of in an appearance of balancing, right? So I can just speak for the Post, and I don't speak for the Post, but I work there. They're trying to figure out how to diversify and how to build resilience into their model through a mix of traffic, subscriptions, paid content, whatever it is, to create some sort of a system that can survive all of this chaos and weather. And I think they're doing a good job. They're profitable. It helps that we have the richest man in the world as our benefactor. And that seemed to be going well as far as it went. And then all of a sudden, the Trump thing hit, okay? And in an industry characterized by chaos and disruption, this was unexpected, okay? And it's hard to overstate the both disruptive and corrosive effect that the Trump administration has had on the way journalists and government do business. I'll give you one very quick example. So earlier this year, I had what I thought was a pretty good scoop, right? I got this secret document, right? And it's all about the Chinese trade negotiations, okay? And the Chinese had submitted this document. And I have it, I'm like, okay, I got the document. And I wrote an article about the document, and my editor's like, you sure? We want the administration to come back. I'm like, no, here's the document, everything's good, 100% sure. Publish the article, go on CNN at 6 o'clock in the morning, talk about the document, the Chinese trade, negotiations. The president sees that and tweets about it. And I'm like, oh my God, the president of the United States is aware of something that I wrote. Isn't that that's a good day in the life of a working journalist? But what did he tweet? Oh, there is no document. It's all fake news. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. CNN judicial retraction. None of this ever happened. I'm like, oh wow, the president just kind of called me a jerk and a liar, And so it's kind of like, oh, well, and then Wilbur Ross got up he was asked about it a couple hours later. He's like, oh yeah, we got the document. Yeah, I saw it yesterday. I'm like, man, what the hell do you do with that? You know what I mean? Like, how do you navigate that? So for the rest of the life of that story, which was like, it's not the Pentagon Papers, it's a good story, right? I was proud of it. 50% of the people who read that story will think that it's totally false forever. There's no way to convince them. There's no way to get them back. And of course, that damages my reputation and my credibility because the President of the United States is calling me a liar. For those people who believe him, I'm always going to be a liar. It's an unsolvable problem, okay? And it's sort of, so what's it like to work with? It's not just the president, right? Working with the Trump administration, there's, as was talked about in the last panel, sort of like a culture of, go screw yourself, okay? And this peters down, you talk about modeling good behavior, throughout the industry. Now, it's not a monolith. There are a lot of people inside the administration who are doing good work, who care about journalism, who believe that they have a fiduciary responsibility. But for anybody who doesn't believe that, they have top cover and permission to just tell you to go screw yourself. Okay, so look at the Pentagon, right? There was a 6-month period this year where the Pentagon didn't have any press conferences. Unprecedented. Jim Mattis, like him or don't like him, he hasn't talked to the press in 6 months, except for these little side chats. That's crazy. Rex Tillerson caught a lot of criticism for not bringing reporters on his plane, right? Well, Pompeo doesn't bring reporters on his trips either. I mean, maybe one, right? So what's going on there, right? It's in Congress. I've seen senators tweet insults at female reporters, accusing them of things that they're not even guilty of on their official Senate Twitter accounts. Unprecedented. You never see that before. It's just, for that part of the, Washington political discussion that wants to use the media as a foil, there's no response that will work, right? So the Washington Post, we have a very sort of clear response to that, which is we're not at war, we're at work, right? The administration can do what it wants. They can call us names what they want. We're going to do the same thing that we always do and try to do it the best we can and be transparent about how we're doing it. I think that's the right approach, right? Thank you. I didn't say that to get applause, but I'll take it. So, I think the question that I struggle with every day is like, is there any going back? Okay, and right now we're in this crazy symbiotic relationship with the administration. Journalism business is doing well. Washington Post is profitable. CNN's profits and ratings are up, despite what the president says. We're fighting each other and we're depending on each other, right, at the same time. But it's so broken, and the ability to sort of check things and to have one record of what happened on a given day is so destroyed that when we have a new administration, when we have a new Congress, can we go back to that? Is there an incentive to go back to that on either side? Now that these norms have been shattered, are they repairable? Who's going to do that? And, as we've been talking about, because now the media is so diversified and spread out, and we can talk about that more, you can choose your own adventure. So is there any incentive for any official or lawmaker to work with the media, organization or reporter that they don't agree with or they're not going to get good coverage with? I don't have the answer to that question. I think that, right now we're all on a sugar high. Everyone gets something out of the media war with the administration, including the media and including the administration. But that's got to end. And what we're going to be left with after that, I think, is going to be, the real crisis in the media, which is yet to come. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so just to kind of pull all the pieces that I think y'all touched on a little bit, pull that thread. You're right that people in government positions or companies, even if we're going to make this a little bit broader, they are choosing not to engage with the media like they used to, right? Because it's not necessary for their end goal. And how does that, what context do we have for that? It feels like a change in norm because there's Twitter and Facebook and other things where people in power can go straight to the people, and that's a validated true source, and they believe they're one politician that is representing them in Congress and nobody else, right? So how does traditional media respond to that and still maintain a relationship of trust with their consumers? And how much of that is on the consumer, though, to go and have those responsibilities to get good information?
Yeah.
And I'll just open that if Josh, you want to go, or anybody.
Just because I talked last, let me start first.
Yeah, as we go back.
I'll be very quick. Partisan media is not new. Yellow journalism is not new. It's part of the American tradition, right? Opinion journalism is not new. Hybrid news opinion journalism, which kind of what I want to do, is not new. All of those things have their place. They have their audience and they have their validity, in my view. And we're not going to be able to sort of go put the genie back in the bottle. That's out. Okay. What I think you see happening, hopefully, if I want to be optimistic for a minute, is that the credibility issue will be self-selecting, right? What was the biggest story in the news yesterday? That this crazy Twitter troll, pro-Trump guy, and his website, which has like a seat in the White House press briefing, which is a total, trolling, horrendous conspiracy theory website, they were cooking up a crazy story about Robert Mueller, and now there's going to be an investigation or prosecution. That's a self-selecting event, right? Over time, educated consumers can make educated decisions based on a track record. The only thing that I can do in this environment is to do my best to keep my own personal credibility and to hold up the high standards of the Post, right? And that's the way out, is that, eventually the people are going to have to come around to not only choosing the media that they like, but the media that they trust. And that's going to be organizational and personal. It's not just, oh, I like the Huffington Post. It's like, oh, I like that writer. He's right. He's usually right on the stuff. He's been proven right over time. So that's not a perfect solution, but that's the settling. And if that happens, then I think that we can sort of move forward as a sort of with media and government. If that doesn't happen, I think we're lost.
Frank, do you want to take that too, especially from like a cable news?
Sure. Several things. First of all, I think we have to recognize that a lot of this was a pre-existing condition. The distrust of the media goes long before Trump. It's what gave the Weekly Standard an audience. It's what gave Roger Ailes an audience. I was doing some snooping around with conservatives because I was getting a lot of this blowback when I was a bureau chief, and I started having very quiet conversations with people to really try to understand what was the beef. Because if you went to media organizations at the time, well, we're just doing our job, and as long as we're getting attacked by both sides, we're doing our job, which was a very lazy way out of a situation where there was legitimate criticism of legitimate issues, from story selection to framing of story to people chosen to be on the air. But we've now been overtaken by events because that level of mistrust and distrust was compounded by the Hurricane Donald. And Hurricane Donald is for real, and it is as disruptive and more so as you're saying. I wish that I could be as hopeful as you may be that people are going to settle out as they become informed consumers, because I think that the very good analogy to this is our actual food diet. All right, we are, everything's labeled. We know that, broccoli is better for us than potato chips, but we eat a lot of potato chips because they're cheaper, they're more fun. We know what they do to us. We know what our obesity issue is in this country, and there it is. So we can label journalism all we want. We can tell people to be informed consumers, but we have to confront the reality that this is a situation that has changed fundamentally and is not going to go back to the days of Walter Cronkite and Peter Jennings ever. And I think it requires a conversation with and among leaders, to include leaders in journalism and leaders in civic life, and the call for a Marshall Plan for civics that we heard here a few minutes ago, to think about what does this really mean for us over the long term. There will be some settling out. I think human beings are hunters and gatherers, and some of what we hunt and gather is information. And so there will be some sorting out of that. But we're in a bubble here in Washington, and we're in a bubble with the people we keep company with. And in a lot of places, when you travel, people don't have the luxury of being meticulous, thoughtful consumers because they're trying to pay their bills and deal with their kids and deal with the plant that may be closing or whatever else it is. And so it's easier to get mad than to get smart, although it helps to do one before you do the other. And so I think that there needs to be a much, much deeper conversation here about what this means and where it's going to go.
I mean, just on this analogy, I was just thinking about this as both of you spoke. And you spoke, Lauren, about consumers and consumer choice. But we do have the FDA, which labels food and drugs, and we don't assume that consumers, without some guidance from government, and presumably from fair-minded and scientific almost agencies, can necessarily make the right choices. On automobiles, we have all kinds of tests that they have to go through before we get to choose between our basic safety tests and others, and also some labeling in terms of miles per gallon and so forth before we choose between our Honda and our Ford or whatever. So obviously you don't have that. I don't think you want to have that even in the media. You have a little bit of informal attempts to do that with fact checking and all this and quasi-consumer reports things, but it's a very different model. So one of the checks in a free market that allows a free market to work, which is a basic some transparency of information about the products, some accountability for the products, both in the private sector, but we don't want that in the media, right? I mean, we have some accountability with libel, but very low standards for public figures, which probably is a good thing. On the other hand, if people get poisoned by a bad food or drug, the company pays a lot and has a big incentive to avoid it in the future, both reputationally, but actually just financially. We don't really, you have a little of that if the media goes way overboard, but basically with public figures, very little ability to discipline them through the legal system in that respect. The Mueller thing is a rare case where, they may be able to actually make people pay a legal penalty for knowingly, but that's a very extreme case, knowingly paying people, literally bribing people to say a falsehood about a public official. And so I think there's that problem. And then if you think about markets, there's another aspect of markets, which I'm dredging this up from my memory, but I think it's dangerous here at George Mason probably, where people actually know something about this. But I mean, Gresham's law, right? Bad money drives out good. No one ever thought that by itself, if you let governments mint fake silver and real silver, or half real, half silver versus whole silver, and doctored currency and so forth, unless there's some way of enforcing a kind of standard, everyone's going to have an incentive to what's the phrase I'm looking for? Drive down to the bottom, compete down. Yeah, not dumbing down, but the equivalent of dumbing down, right? Driving, competing down to the bottom, or race to the bottom kind of thing, right? That also is a kind of market phenomenon. And you can imagine that in media. So hopefully at some point, of course, now the one answer to that would be when reality hits, and that's sort of what we count on in life in general, and also in consumer behavior. And if you get sick eating something, you just stop eating it. And if the economy collapses, you decide those economic policies weren't wise. And if there's a huge amount of fear mongering and scaremongering about a particular population or a particular policy, and then the things don't happen, you would think, okay, well, that's going to be kind of discredited. The trouble is, politics is a little different there, and you can do an awful lot of fear mongering and scaremongering, and it doesn't quite happen, and the fearmongers and scaremongers say, well, it's coming. The conspiracy is so deep that you don't quite see yet how bad it is, right? And we have had this in the past in every democracy, obviously. I do think the coming to, and I'd say the caravan thing is a good example. I mean, the last caravan petered out and it wasn't dangerous, and the people in it weren't mostly, threatening types, and there aren't Middle Easterners there, and it's a complicated policy issue of exactly what kind of refugee policy you want to have at the border. But the notion that 7,000 or now 3,000 people, 1,500 miles away in Mexico are a fundamental threat to our safety in the United States of America is a little crazy. And but I'm amazed. I don't know what you guys have found on this, or you. I mean, how much people have raised it to me, and not crazy people and well-educated people and people. I was giving a talk in Newport Beach, which in California, which is a nice place if you haven't been there. And people in Newport Beach are not, poorly educated or living on the margin or suffering from, middle America sort of wage stagnation and all that stuff. They're the beneficiaries of globalization. They're the beneficiaries of today's America, and they were very alarmed about it. I mean, I remember saying it doesn't seem to me it's a huge problem. I mean, A, they're not going to get in. B, if they get in, they're going to disperse, and they're going to have 7,000 more people. And let's say they all come to California. California is a state of, 40 million people or something. I don't think you're really going to notice them, But you don't understand. It's very dangerous. That's what worries me the most. And I do think you do have, and the way I've been thinking about it recently, Donald Trump, in my opinion, not to obsess about Trump, but is a demagogue, and he's a clever demagogue. And we've had demagogues before. Joe McCarthy, George Wallace, you name it, on all kinds of issues, foreign policy, race, other issues, and right and left, I would say. We haven't had a demagogue who's become president, and that is a qualitatively different. You're a senator. McCarthy's a very good instance. You cause real problems in the country for 3-4 years. You get some people unfairly accused of things and their careers are damaged. You mess up our foreign policy, I would say, from a sound anti-communism to a little, craziness for 3-4 years. But at the end of the day, he's marginalized. Eisenhower kind of takes care of him quietly. The Senate rebels against him. People get sick of it and tired of it almost. And 5 years after Joe McCarthy, you could write a history of American foreign policy from 1945 to 1985 and probably have a pretty short passage on Joe McCarthy and just conclude at the end of the day he didn't really make much difference. That's a senator. George Wallace, not good for race relations in America, not good for the progress of African Americans. But at the end of the day, the movement happened. There's this parenthesis that there's a particular governor who was a particularly demagogic figure for 5-10 years in a very fraught time and didn't really change the course of history. I don't know. You can't be as confident about that with presidents. And just finally, and this echoes really what you both said, I think the coming together of Trump as president with the social media phenomenon and the tribalization of politics and the media and the echo chamber problem and all this stuff is just maybe it's bad luck, maybe it's not luck, but in any case, that is a kind of perfect storm. A demagogue without Fox News, without social media, would have less ability, I think, to be a successful demagogue. Fox News, and not to blame Fox entirely, but just for now, let's just do it. Fox News and parts of social media, the kind of websites Josh was mentioning, without Trump as president, would be doing stuff, and some congressman would be echoing them, and some people would be talking about it, and it would be, hey, what about this? But it would be like actually the Bush and Obama years, where there were the fringes of both parties screaming and complaining about stuff, and most of the parties and the government kind of went about their business in a more traditional way. The coming together of the demagogue with the social media and tribalization and echo chamber aspect of things is I think, a sort of uniquely dangerous.
I wanted, if I could, just mention to this point, both points. If you're not familiar with Clay Shirky's work, you probably should read it. Clay Shirky is at NYU, and he wrote this book, among other things, called Here Comes Everybody. And he argues that social media is not evolutionary in our communications, but revolutionary. And what makes it revolutionary is that for the first time in human history, we have a technology that breaks the one to the many model, the king to his subjects, the president to the citizens, the New York Times to the readers. But in the everybody to everybody model, everybody is empowered. And that is a fundamental change in the information equation and the power equation. And I think that's critical to understand whether we're talking about how to get people on a healthier diet or how to counter some of these things that you're both talking about. That is a very substantial and basic change.
Yeah,
and that's a great thing in some ways, because you don't depend on the one restaurant reviewer in the Washington Post or the papers here in Northern Virginia. You get to go on Yelp and read 100 reviews, and leaving aside whether that system can be gamed itself by the equivalent of Russians, by having the restaurant owner put up fake reviews. But assuming it's sort of authentic, though, I find this personally, I'm sure you all do, in terms of just judging. The consumer reports aspect of social media is great. The crowdsourcing can be great, and you can learn a ton, as I said earlier. But I agree, but I very much.
When you now read it, though,
but it's a very different model. I think that's a very important point. It's not an incremental difference. It's a qualitatively different way of information spreading, and in that respect, Facebook, I think, is almost unique, even more than Twitter or Yelp. Those things are posts which everyone reads the same thing. So ultimately, they can figure out a way to monitor the Yelp, to make sure the Yelp reviews are authentic, and everyone reads the Yelp reviews and you decide if you agree that the restaurant across the street is better or not than some other one. Social media Facebook is weird, and I haven't really thought this through, and I'm not an expert on it. I'm not on Facebook, so I will be quiet after a second, because I'm not the best person to talk about it. But the fact that the material you get is tailored to you, in effect, which really is slightly true on other forums. You select who you want to follow on Twitter, but that's more like deciding to read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Here, you get what you see is itself tailored on what you've previously chosen to see or to forward or to like or whatever. And that has a certain self-fulfilling character and a certain echo chamberish character that I think is different from other things.
Yeah, and it's not just Facebook that does that. The Washington Post actually does that as well on their homepage. So a lot of, they realize what type of content that you're clicking on, and then they feed you content on the front page that is aligned with what you think. And then I think they have a policy that also show you the other side as well, right? They actually choose to show you the opposing view.
The difference is markedly less amount of Russian intelligence content. Not zero, but a lot less than Facebook, right? So, this is like, my point is,
Post reporters. So at the end of the day, hopefully, Fred Hyatt, or
like ideally zero.
Exercising guidance on the editorial, on the opinion writers, and it's a limited. They're only the people you have a choice of. I agree, it's a little bit like that, but there's still a very much old-fashioned.
Right, but my
pre-selection of who you could read.
But my point,
that's all out the window with Facebook, obviously.
Well, I mean, I guess my point is that a lot of people who didn't grow up with the technology focus on the technology, but it's not really about the technology. It's about the content and the humans and the choices. Twitter is not responsible for the awfulness that goes on Twitter. The people are responsible, right? Guns don't kill people. People kill people. Guns just make it a lot easier, right? When the people went to Tahrir Square, that wasn't a Twitter revolution. That was a human revolution facilitated by Twitter. So I think for the younger generation of journalists, we're technology agnostic, okay? And sure, these companies are entities and they have personalities and leaders and humans, right? And so, a lot of, we got to do something about this technology. The technology is disruptive. No, it's the way that the people use the technology, and it's the way that these companies operate. And these companies either have standards or they don't. They either have ethics or they don't. They're either, selling their platforms to foreign intelligence agencies to interfere in our democracy, or they're not. But that's not the platform's fault. Artificial intelligence is just statistics. It's just ones and zeros. It's not a moral entity in and of itself. So I think overall we need to focus more on the humans and less on the ones and zeros.
So I would just say slightly leaning against, I agree basically with that, of course, but people with guns do kill more people than people without guns. And societies, and I'm saying this as someone who's not incidentally particularly even a gun control person, but societies where guns happen to be, for various historical reasons, incredibly readily available, tend to have higher murder rates than other societies that don't. And that's not the main thing. And of course, that doesn't stay. We also, so it has to be taken into account in thinking about policy.
Sure, but it's
like Julia, so it doesn't mean we cut crime in this country and we cut murders in New York by 80%. So it doesn't mean that you're fatalistic about it.
But it's not a perfect analogy in the sense that we give our government, hopefully on a good day, the power to regulate dangerous weapons, right? That's not how it works for journalism, okay? And that's because of the First Amendment. And once we start getting into the idea that government should regulate journalism, well, that's a slippery slope into the authoritarian media environments that we despise.
The first thing that government should do is to understand and defend journalism.
Ideally.
Okay? I mean, the most, in my view, the most corrosive, there are several most corrosive effects of Hurricane Donald, and they don't relate to his policies. As a journalist, I've covered Republicans and Democrats. Bill and I were talking about this outside. You want to cut taxes? Cut taxes. You want to raise taxes? Raise taxes. Have that debate. Yes, fine. But what has happened in the present environment, and this is I think, I covered Reagan's famous speech at Moscow State University where he had this big riff about a free press and the value of a free press. And that brought accountability, and that brought, he didn't use those words exactly, but he did, because he was lecturing the communists. And I actually think he believed that. But now we have a situation where the President of the United States is methodically undermining confidence in a series of institutions. The press is one of those. And as we've talked about with the courts, the most significant thing that the courts have is this kind of compact with the public, that this is a legitimate, they don't have guns, they can't, some, they actually can enforce these things, but there's that notion of public support, just as there should be with a free press, understanding that it's going to be wrong, sensational, unfair, all those things, sometimes, maybe a lot of times.
Yeah.
I think that's
absolutely right. I would even go one step further. He's not only undermining the institution of the free press, intentionally, admittedly, proudly, in fact, if he talks about it all the time, he's inciting anger that's spilling over into violence against journalists.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Of course.
And my colleagues who go to cover Trump rallies can't do it without armed security guards.
We now have security at these things. I've spoken with a number of news organizations recently who've told me just in the past several months they have added round-the-clock security in their offices where that would have been unthinkable.
And I'd also point out that Ronald Reagan pushed American values, because he believed it was part of the American interest, the national interest. And I can't be sure, but I can't imagine that an allied country like Saudi Arabia would feel it had license to kill a Washington Post columnist on that watch. So there's a broader effect on journalists worldwide that I think is dangerous and unfortunate.
Thanks. We are going to move to Q&A, and we didn't even cover half the things that I wanted to cover on this topic. So we didn't even.
Because there's nothing to talk about on this topic.
We didn't even touch on foreign influence, but I'll kick it now. I'm looking at Grant. Whoever needs the microphone, great, sir.
Thanks. The comment that most struck home for me was being on the sugar high, that you need to break that habit. Because the sound is off at an airport. You see on the chyron some mistruth that the president has spoken, and it stays up there for 2 or 3 minutes, and you can't hear the sound. So all you're seeing is that piece of misinformation. When I get my Washington Post feed, there'll be 25 articles. 15 of them will have Trump's name in them. That's a sugar high.
For sure.
You guys are responsible for that, and you're also at effect of it. How do you break that?
Yeah, I mean, since it was my comment, I guess I should respond. I don't know. The incentives are all distorted, right? It's just a fact. I'm very lucky. I work for a company that gives me the resources and support to do work that may not get a lot of clicks, that may have more of a policy than a political or popular impact. I think that's, part of it is sort of like, remember when the news divisions used to get paid for by the entertainment divisions? There has to be some sorts of trade-offs in these news organizations where they, spend down the Trump clicks in order to do the journalism that is important. But the point is that Trump will go away, okay? Sooner or later, one way or another, in 2 years or 6 years, or hopefully he will not be the president of the United States. What are we going to do then?
But I would just say on that, I mean, you don't break. I mean, look, I want to say some of this is a little overstated, I think. Joe McGinnis wrote a book 50 years ago, The Selling of the President, about how Roger Ailes actually, ironically, helped sell Nixon, give him a new persona, the new Nixon in 1968, through skillful manipulation of TV images. Michael Deaver, famously in the Reagan White House, understood that this was the claim at least, it was much more important what people saw in the news than what was said by the
job is to light the president.
Yeah, and that Reagan got away. This was sort of the liberal line at the time, and before everyone decided afterwards they liked Reagan, that Reagan got away with these incredible photo ops, and of course the substance, meanwhile, was terrible, or at least not consistent with the photo ops. So I think the Chiron point's a good point, but I also think it's something that's been there forever, and before that it was there with Yellow, with the newspaper, tabloid newspapers and so forth. So I guess I think it's a problem. But I guess I come back to the fact that if you didn't, it still matters a huge, and this is not what Josh said, but I'll just say it about the politicians. I came to this from government, from politics, more than from the media side. Politicians have wanted to get reelected forever. They've wanted to be slightly demagogic forever. They've distorted things forever, but never in this way. Certainly never in this way, and never from the very top when you're president, and never in a moment of crisis or emergency. So you make your cheap points against your opponent, and you run some ads, and you exaggerate your accomplishments on the economy and deprecate your predecessor and so forth, and you oversell your tax cuts and you undersell something else. That's very different, though. And so I guess I'm a little contrarian on this, in that maybe this is in a way what Josh was saying earlier, that the platforms, I wonder if we would be having this discussion if Donald Trump had chosen not to run for president in 2015, and Scott Walker or some boring Republican had been the nominee against Hillary Clinton, and one of them would have won, and we would have a center-right or center-left administration, and Facebook would be doing its thing. This doesn't quite get to the foreign issue, so that's a national security issue. I agree with that. But on this sort of more general flavor of our politics, would we feel that it was quite as much worse as it has been? Was it that terrible under Bush or Obama? That would seem more to me like the heatedness of previous administrations. So I guess I do come back to, it's hard to know. I agree with you, Trump will go at some point. It's hard to know. You don't go back to the way it was. And the biggest question for me, therefore, is how much does Trump leave a Trumpified politics behind him? Does everyone decide, well, that's the way you succeed?